Chapter 4. Ideas and the Synthesis of Difference. Kant never ceased to remind us that ideas are essentially problematic. Conversely, problems are ideas. Undoubtedly, he shows that ideas lead us into false problems, but this is not their most profound characteristic. If, according to Kant, reason does pose false problems and therefore itself gives rise to illusion, this is because in the first place it is the faculty of posing problems in general. In its natural state such a faculty lacks the means to distinguish what is true or false, what is founded or not, in any problem it poses. The aim of the critical operation is precisely to provide this means, since the science of metaphysics has to deal not with the objects of reason, the variety of which is inexhaustible, but only with itself and the problems which arise entirely from within itself. 1. We are told that false problems result from an illegitimate employment of ideas. It follows that not every problem is false. In accordance with their properly understood critical character, ideas have a perfectly legitimate regulative function in which they constitute true problems or pose well-founded problems. That is why regulative means problematic. Ideas are themselves problematic or problematizing, and Kant tries to show the difference between, on the one hand, problematic and, on the other, hypothetical, fictitious, general, or abstract, despite certain texts in which he assimilates the terms. In what sense, then, does Kantian reason, in so far as it is the faculty of ideas, pose or constitute problems? The fact is that it alone is capable of drawing together the procedures of the understanding with regard to a set of objects. 2. The understanding by itself would remain entangled in its separate and divided procedures, a prisoner of partial empirical inquiries or researches in regard to this or that object, never raising itself to the level of a problem capable of providing a systematic unity for all its operations. The understanding alone would obtain answers or results here and there, but these would never constitute a solution. For every solution presupposes a problem, in other words, the constitution of a unitary and systematic field which orientates and subsumes the researches or investigations in such a manner that the answers, in turn, form precisely cases of solution. Kant even refers to ideas as problems to which there is no solution. 3. By that he does not mean that ideas are necessarily false problems and thus insoluble, but, on the contrary, that true problems are ideas, and that these ideas do not disappear with their solutions, since they are the indispensable condition without which no solution would ever exist. Ideas have legitimate uses only in relation to concepts of the understanding, but conversely, the Con 168 ideas and the synthesis of difference 169 steps of the understanding find the ground of their maximum, full experimental use only in the degree to which they are related to problematic ideas, either by being arranged upon lines which converge upon an ideal focus which lies outside the bounds of experience, or by being conceived on the basis of a common horizon which embraces them all. Such focal points or horizons are ideas, in other words, problems as such, whose nature is at once both immanent and transcendent. Problems have an objective value, while ideas in some sense have an object. Problematic does not mean only a particularly important species of subjective acts, but a dimension of objectivity as such which is occupied by these acts. An object outside experience can be represented only in problematic form. This does not mean that ideas have no real object, but that problems qua problems are the real objects of ideas. The object of an idea, Kant reminds us, is neither fiction nor hypothesis nor object of reason. It is an object which can be neither given nor known, but must be represented without being able to be directly determined. Kant likes to say that problematic ideas are both objective and undetermined. The undetermined is not a simple imperfection in our knowledge or a lack in the object, it is a perfectly positive, objective structure which acts as a focus or horizon within perception. In effect, the undetermined object, or object as it exists in the idea, allows us to represent other objects, those of experience, which it endows with a maximum of systematic unity. Ideas would not systematize the formal procedures of the understanding if their objects did not lend a similar unity to the matter or content of phenomena. In this manner, however, the undetermined is only the first objective moment of the idea. For on the other hand, the object of the idea becomes indirectly determined, it is determined by analogy with those objects of experience upon which it confers unity, but which in return offer it a determination analogous to the relations it entertains with them. Finally, the object of the idea carries with it the ideal of a complete and infinite determination, since it ensures a specification of the concepts of the understanding, by means of which the latter comprise more and more differences on the basis of a properly infinite field of continuity. Ideas, therefore, present three moments, undetermined with regard to their object, determinable with regard to objects of experience, and bearing the ideal of an infinite determination with regard to concepts of the understanding. It is apparent that ideas here repeat the three aspects of the cogito, the I am as an indeterminate existence, time as the form under which this existence is determinable, and the I think as a determination. Ideas are exactly the thoughts of the cogito, the differentials of thought. Moreover, in so far as the cogito refers to a fractured I, an I split from end to end by the form of time which runs through it, it must be said that ideas swarm in the fracture, constantly emerging on its edges, ceaselessly coming out and going back, being composed in 1,000 different manners. It is 170 difference and repetition, not, therefore, a question of filling that which cannot be filled. Nevertheless, just as difference immediately reunites and articulates that which it distinguishes, and the fracture retains what it fractures, so ideas contain their dismembered moments. It is for the idea to interiorise the fracture and its ant-like inhabitants. There is neither identification nor confusion within the idea, but rather an internal problematic objective unity of the undetermined, the determinable, and determination. Perhaps this does not appear sufficiently clearly in Kant. According to him, two of the three moments remain as extrinsic characteristics. If ideas are in themselves undetermined, they are determinable only in relation to objects of experience, and bear the ideal of determination only in relation to concepts of the understanding. Furthermore, Kant incarnated these moments in distinct ideas: the self is above all undetermined, the world is determinable, and God is the ideal of determination. It is here, perhaps, that we should seek the real reasons for which, just as the post-Kantians objected, Kant held fast to the point of view of conditioning without attaining that of genesis. If the mistake of dogmatism is always to fill that which separates, that of empiricism is to leave external what is separated, and in this sense there is still too much empiricism in the critique, and too much dogmatism among the post-Kantians. The critical point, the horizon, or focal point at which difference qua difference serves to reunite, has not yet been assigned. Just as we oppose difference in itself to negativity, so we oppose dx to nota, the symbol of difference philosophy to that of contradiction. It is true that contradiction seeks its idea on the side of the greatest difference, whereas the differential risks falling into the abyss of the infinitely small. This, however, is not the way to formulate the problem. It is a mistake to tie the value of the symbol dx to the existence of infinitesimals, but it is also a mistake to refuse it any ontological or gnoseological value in the name of a refusal of the latter. In fact, there is a treasure buried within the old so-called barbaric or pre-scientific interpretations of the differential calculus, which must be separated from its infinitesimal matrix. A great deal of heart and a great deal of truly philosophical naivete is needed in order to take the symbol dx seriously. For their part, Kant and even Leibniz renounced the idea. Nevertheless, in the esoteric history of differential philosophy, three names shine forth like bright stars: Salomon Maimon, who, paradoxically, sought to ground post-Kantianism upon a Leibnizian reinterpretation of the calculus, 1790, Heinrinsky, a profound mathematician who developed a positivist, messianic and mystical system which implied a Kantian interpretation of the calculus, 1814, and Jean-Baptiste Desmoulins who, in the course of reflections upon Descartes, offered a Platonic interpretation of the calculus, 1843. A Leibniz, a Kant, and a Plato of ideas and the synthesis of difference. 171. The calculus, the many philosophical riches to be found here must not be sacrificed to modern scientific technique. The principle of a general differential philosophy must be the object of a rigorous exposition, and must in no way depend upon the infinitely small. The symbol dx appears as simultaneously undetermined, determinable, and determination. Three principles which together form a sufficient reason correspond to these three aspects. A principle of determinability corresponds to the undetermined as such, dx, dy, a principle of reciprocal determination corresponds to the really determinable, dy/dx, a principle of complete determination corresponds to the effectively determined, values of dy/dx. In short, dx is the idea, the Platonic, Leibnizian, or Kantian idea, the problem and its being. The idea of fire subs s fire in the form of a single continuous mass capable of increase. The idea of silver subs s its object in the form of a liquid continuity of fine metal. However, while it is true that continuousness must be related to ideas and to their problematic use, this is on condition that it be no longer defined by characteristics borrowed from sensible or even geometric intuition, as it still is when one speaks of the interpolation of intermediaries, of infinite intercalary series or parts which are never the smallest possible. Continuousness truly belongs to the realm of ideas only to the extent that an ideal cause of continuity is determined. Taken together with its cause, continuity forms the pure element of quantitability, which must be distinguished both from the fixed quantities of intuition quantum and from variable quantities in the form of concepts of the understanding quantitas. The symbol which expresses it is therefore completely undetermined. Dx is strictly nothing in relation to x, as dy is in relation to y. The whole problem, however, lies in the signification of these zeros. Quanta as objects of intuition always have particular values, and even when they are united in a fractional relation, each maintains a value independently of the relation. As a concept of the understanding, quantitas has a general value, generality here referring to an infinity of possible particular values, as many as the variable can assume. However, there must always be a particular value charged with representing the others, and withstanding for them. This is the case with the algebraic equation for the circle, x2 plus lr2 equals 0. The same does not hold for y dy plus x dx equals 0, which signifies the universal of the circumference or of the corresponding function. The zeros involved in dx and dy express the annihilation of the quantum and the quantitas, of the general as well as the particular, in favor of the universal and its appearance. The force of the interpretation given by Bordest-Demelin is as follows: it is not the differential quantities which are cancelled in dy/dx or percent but rather the individual and the individual relations within the function. By individual, Bordest means both the particular and the general. We have passed from one genus to another, as if to die other side of the mirror, having lost its mutable part or the property of variation. The function represents only the 172 difference and repetition immutable along with the operation which uncovered it. That which is cancelled changes in it, and in being cancelled allows a glimpse beyond of that which does not change. In short, the limit must be conceived not as the limit of a function but as a genuine cut coupure, a border between the changeable and the unchangeable within the function itself. Newton's mistake, therefore, is that of making the differentials equal to 0, while Leibniz's mistake is to identify them with the individual or with variability. In this respect, Bordest is already close to the modern interpretation of calculus. The limit no longer presupposes the ideas of a continuous variable and infinite approximation. On the contrary, the notion of limit grounds a new, static, and purely ideal definition of continuity, while its own definition implies no more than number, or rather, the universal in number. Modern mathematics then specifies the nature of this universal of number as consisting in the cut, in the sense of Dedekind. In this sense, it is the cut which constitutes the next genus of number, the ideal cause of continuity or the pure element of quantitability. In relation to x, dx is completely undetermined, as dy is to y, but they are perfectly determinable in relation to one another. For this reason, a principle of determinability corresponds to the undetermined as such. The universal is not a nothing, since there are, in Borges's expression, relations of the universal. Dx and dy are completely undifferentiated indifferences, in the particular and in the general, but completely differentiated differentes in and by the universal. The relation dy/dx is not like a fraction which is established between particular quanta in intuition, but neither is it a general relation between variable algebraic magnitudes or quantities. Each term exists absolutely only in its relation to the other. It is no longer necessary, or even possible, to indicate an independent variable. For this reason, a principle of reciprocal determinability as such here corresponds to the determinability of the relation. The effectively synthetic function of ideas is presented and developed by means of a reciprocal synthesis. The whole question, then, is, in what form is the differential relation determinable? It is determinable first in qualitative form, and in this connection it expresses a function which differs in kind from the so-called primitive function. When the primitive function expresses the curve, dy/dx equals, x ly expresses the trigonometric tangent of the angle made by the tangent of the curve and the axis of the abscissa. The importance of this qualitative difference or change of function within the differential has often been emphasized. In the same way, the cut designates the irrational numbers which differ in kind from the terms of the series of rational numbers. This is only a first aspect, however, for insofar as it expresses another quality, the differential relation remains tied to the individual values or to the quantitative variations corresponding to that quality, for example, tangent. It is therefore differentiable in turn, and testifies only to the power of ideas to give rise to ideas of ideas. The universal in relation to ideas and the synthesis of difference 173 equality must not, therefore, be confused with the individual values it takes in relation to another quality. In its universal function it expresses not simply that other quality but a pure element of qualitability. In this sense the idea has the differential relation as its object. It then integrates variation, not as a variable determination of a supposedly constant relation, variability, but, on the contrary, as a degree of variation of the relation itself, variety, to which corresponds, for example, the qualified series of curves. If the idea eliminates variability, this is in favor of what must be called variety or multiplicity. The idea as concrete universal stands opposed to concepts of the understanding, and possesses a comprehension all the more vast as its extension is great. This is what defines the universal synthesis of the idea of the idea, etc. The reciprocal dependence of the degrees of the relation, and ultimately the reciprocal dependence of the relations themselves. It is Salomon Maimon who proposes a fundamental reformulation of the critique and an overcoming of the Kantian duality between concept and intuition. Such a duality refers us back to the extrinsic criterion of constructibility and leaves us with an external relation between the determinable, Kantian space as a pure given, and the determination, the concept insofar as it is thought. That the one should be adapted to the other by the intermediary of the schematism only reinforces the paradox introduced into the doctrine of the faculties by the notion of a purely external harmony, whence the reduction of the transcendental instance to a simple conditioning and the renunciation of any genetic requirement. In Kant, therefore, difference remains external and as such empirical and impure, suspended outside the construction between the determinable intuition and the determinant concept. Malman's genius lies in showing how inadequate the point of view of conditioning is for a transcendental philosophy. Both terms of the difference must equally be thought, in other words, determinability must itself be conceived as pointing towards a principle of reciprocal determination. The concepts of the understanding recognize reciprocal determination, if only in a completely formal and reflexive manner, for example, in the cases of causality and reciprocal influence. The reciprocal synthesis of differential relations as the source of the production of real objects, this is the substance of ideas insofar as they bathe in the thought element of qualitability. A triple genesis follows from this. that of qualities, produced in the form of differences between real objects of knowledge, that of space and time in the form of conditions for the knowledge of differences, that of concepts in the form of conditions for the difference or the distinction between knowledges themselves. Physical judgment thus tends to ensure its primacy over mathematical judgment, while the origin of extensity is inseparable from the origin of the objects which populate it. Ideas appear in the form of a system of ideal connections, in other words, a system of differential relations between 174 difference and repetition reciprocally determined genetic elements. The cogito incorporates all the power of a differential unconscious, an unconscious of pure thought which internalizes the difference between the determinable self and the determining I, and injects into thought as such something unthought, without which its operation would always remain impossible and empty. Maimon writes, when I say, for example, red is different from green, the concept of the difference in so far as this is a pure concept of the understanding is not considered to be the relation between the sensible qualities, otherwise the Kantian question quid juris would still apply. Rather, either, in accordance with Kant's theory, it is considered to be the relation between their spaces as a priori forms, or, in accordance with my own theory, it is considered to be the relation between their differentials which are a priori ideas. A particular object is the result of the particular rule of its production or the mode of its differential, and the relations between different objects result from the relations between their differentials. 6 In order to understand better the alternative offered by Maimon, let us return to a famous example: the straight line is the shortest path. Shortest may be understood in two ways: from the point of view of conditioning, as a schema of the imagination which determines space in accordance with the concept, the straight line defined as that which in all parts may be superimposed upon itself. In this case the difference remains external, incarnated in a rule of construction which is established between the concept and the intuition. Alternatively, from the genetic point of view, the shortest may be understood as an idea which overcomes the duality of concept and intuition, interiorizes the difference between straight and curved, and expresses this internal difference in the form of a reciprocal determination and in the minimal conditions of an integral. The shortest is not a schema but an idea, or it is an ideal schema and no longer the schema of a concept. In this sense, the mathematician How remarked that the shortest distance was not a Euclidean notion at all, but an Archimedean one, more physical than mathematical, that it was inseparable from a method of exhaustion, and that it served less to determine the straight line than to determine the length of a curve by means of the straight line, integral calculus performed unknowingly. 7 Finally, the differential relation presents a third element, that of pure potentiality. Power is the form of reciprocal determination according to which variable magnitudes are taken to be functions of one another. In consequence, calculus considers only those magnitudes where at least one is of a power superior to another. No doubt the first act of the calculus consists in a depotentialization of the equation. For example, instead of 2x, x2 equals y2 we have dy/dx equals axyy. However, the analog may be found in the two preceding figures where the disappearance of the quantum and ideas and the synthesis of difference 175 the quantitas was the condition for the appearance of the element of quantitability, and disqualification the condition for the appearance of the element of qualitability. This time, following Lagrange's presentation, the depotentialization conditions pure potentiality by allowing an evolution of the function of a variable in a series constituted by the powers of I, undetermined quantity, and the coefficients of these powers, new functions of x, in such a way that the evolution function of that variable be comparable to that of the others. The pure element of potentiality appears in the first coefficient or the first derivative, the other derivatives and consequently all the terms of the series resulting from the repetition of the same operations. The whole problem, however, lies precisely in determining this first coefficient which is itself independent of I. It is on this point that Wronski's objection intervenes, being directed as much against Lagrange's presentation, Taylor's series, as against Carnot's compensation of errors. Against Carnot, he objects that the so-called auxiliary equations are incorrect not because they imply dx and dy but because they neglect certain complementary quantities which diminish at the same time as dx and dy, far from explaining the nature of differential calculus. Therefore, Carnot's presentation presupposes it. The same applies to Lagrange's series, where, from the point of view of the rigorous algorithm which, according to Wronski, characterizes transcendental philosophy, the discontinuous coefficients assume a signification only by virtue of the differential functions which compose them. If it is true that the understanding provides a discontinuous summation, this is only the matter for the generation of quantities, only graduation or continuity constitutes their form, which belongs to ideas of reason. That is why differentials certainly do not correspond to any engendered quantity, but rather constitute an unconditioned rule for the production of knowledge of quantity, and for the construction of series or the generation of discontinuities which constitute its materia. 1.8 As Wronski says, the differential is an ideal difference without which Lagrange's undetermined quantity could not carry out the determination expected of it. In this sense, the differential is indeed pure power, just as the differential relation is a pure element of potentiality. A principle of complete determination corresponds to this element of potentiality. Complete determination must not be confused with reciprocal determination. The latter concern the differential relations and their degrees or varieties in the idea which correspond to diverse forms. The former concerns the values of a relation, in other words, the composition of a form or the distribution of singular points which characterize it, for example, when the relation becomes null, infinite, or 0/0. It is indeed a question of the complete determination of the parts of the object. It is now in the object, and therefore on the curve, that the elements which present the previously defined linear relation must be found. Moreover, it is only 176 difference and repetition here that the serial form within potentiality assumes its full meaning. It even becomes necessary to present what is a relation in the form of a sum. For a series of powers with numerical coefficients surround one singular point, and only one at a time. The interest and the necessity of the serial form appear in the plurality of series subsumed by it, in their dependence upon singular points, and in the manner in which we can pass from one part of the object where the function is represented by a series to another where it is expressed in a different series, whether the two series converge or extend one another or, on the contrary, diverge. Just as determinability pointed towards reciprocal determination, so the latter points towards complete determination. All three form the figure of sufficient reason in the threefold element of quantitability, qualitability, and potentiality. Ideas are concrete universals in which extension and comprehension go together, not only because they include variety or multiplicity in themselves, but because they include singularity in all its varieties. They subsume the distribution of distinctive or singular points, their distinctive character, in other words, the distinctness of ideas, consists precisely in the distribution of the ordinary and the distinctive, the singular and the regular, and in the extension of the singular across regular points into the vicinity of another singularity. There is no abstract universal beyond the individual or beyond the particular and the general, it is singularity itself which is pre-individual. The interpretation of the differential calculus has indeed taken the form of asking whether infinitesimals are real or fictive. From the beginning, however, other issues were also involved. Is the fate of calculus tied to infinitesimals, or must it not be given a rigorous status from the point of view of finite representation? The real frontier defining modern mathematics lies not in the calculus itself but in other discoveries such as set theory which, even though it requires, for its own part, an axiom of infinity, gives a no less strictly finite interpretation of the calculus. We know in effect that the notion of limit has lost its phronimic character and involves only static considerations, that variability has ceased to represent a progression through all the values of an interval and come to mean only the disjunctive assumption of one value within that interval, that the derivative and the integral have become ordinal rather than quantitative concepts, and finally that the differential designates only a magnitude left undetermined so that it can be made smaller than a given number as required. The birth of structuralism at this point coincides with the death of any genetic or dynamic ambitions of the calculus. It is precisely this alternative between infinite and finite representation that is at issue when we speak of the metaphysics of calculus. Moreover, this alternative, and therefore the metaphysics, are strictly immanent to the techniques of the calculus itself. Ideas and the synthesis of difference 177. That is why the metaphysical question was announced from the outset: why is it that, from a technical point of view, the differentials are negligible and must disappear in the result? It is obvious that to invoke here the infinitely small, and the infinitely small magnitude of the error, if there is error, is completely lacking in sense and prejudges infinite representation. The rigorous response was given by Carnot in his famous reflections on the metaphysics of infinitesimal calculus, but precisely from the point of view of a finite interpretation, the differential equations are simple auxiliaries expressing the conditions of the problem to which responds a desired equation, but a strict compensation of errors is produced between them such that no differentials persist in the result, since the latter can be arrived at only between fixed or finite quantities. By invoking the notions of problem and problem conditions, however, Carnot opened up for metaphysics a path which went beyond the frame of his own theory. Already Leibniz had shown that calculus was the instrument of a comentatore, in other words, that it expressed problems which could not hitherto be solved or, indeed, even posed, transcendent problems. One thinks in particular of the role of the regular and singular points which enter into the complete determination of a species of curve. No doubt the specification of the singular points, for example, dips, nodes, focal points, centers, is undertaken by means of the form of integral curves, which refers back to the solutions for the differential equation. There is nevertheless a complete determination with regard to the existence and distribution of these points which depends upon a completely different instance, namely, the field of vectors defined by the equation itself. The complementarity of these two aspects does not obscure their difference in kind, on the contrary. Moreover, if the specification of the points already shows the necessary immanence of the problem in the solution, its involvement in the solution which covers it, along with the existence and the distribution of points, testifies to the transcendence of the problem and its directive role in relation to the organization of the solutions themselves. In short, the complete determination of a problem is inseparable from the existence, the number, and the distribution of the determinant points which precisely provide its conditions. One singular point gives rise to two condition equations. 9 However, it then becomes more and more difficult to speak of error or the compensation of errors. The condition equations are not simply auxiliaries, nor are they imperfect equations, as Carnot suggested. They are constitutive of the problem, and of its synthesis. It is through lack of understanding of the ideal objective nature of the problematic that these are reduced to errors, albeit useful ones, or fictions, albeit well-founded ones, in any case, to a subjective moment of imperfect, approximative, or erroneous knowledge. By problematic we mean the ensemble of the problem and its conditions. If the differentials disappear in the result, this is to the extent that the problem instance differs in kind 178 difference and repetition from the solution instance, it is in the movement by which the solutions necessarily come to conceal the problem. It is in the sense that the conditions of the problem are the object of a synthesis in the idea which cannot be expressed in the analysis of the propositional concepts constituting cases of solution. As a result, the first alternative, real or fictive, collapses. Neither real nor fictive, differentials express the nature of a problematic as such, its objective consistency along with its subjective autonomy. Perhaps the other alternative collapses as well, that between infinite and finite representation. As we have seen, infinite and finite are indeed characteristics of a representation in so far as the concept that it implicates develops all its possible comprehension or, on the contrary, blocks it. In any case, the representation of difference refers to the identity of the concept as its principle. We can therefore treat representations like propositions of consciousness, designating cases of solution in relation to the concept in general. However, the problematic element, with its extra-propositional character, does not fall within representation. Neither particular nor general, neither finite nor infinite, it is the object of the idea as a universal. This differential element is the play of difference as such, which can neither be mediated by representation nor subordinated to the identity of the concept. The antinomy of the finite and the infinite emerges precisely when Kant feels himself obliged, by virtue of the special nature of cosmology, to pour into representation the content corresponding to the idea of the world. The antinomy is resolved, according to him, when on the one hand he discovers within representation an element irreducible to either infinity or finitude, regress, and when on the other he adds to this element the pure thought of another element which differs in kind from representation, noumena. However, to the extent that this pure thought remains undetermined, or is not determined as differential, representation, for its part, is not really overcome, any more than the propositions of consciousness which constitute the substance and the details of the antinomies. In a different manner, modern mathematics also leaves us in a state of antinomy, since the strict finite interpretation that it gives of the calculus nevertheless presupposes an axiom of infinity in the set theoretical foundation, even though this axiom finds no illustration in calculus. What is still emig is the extra-propositional or sub-representative element expressed in the idea by the differential, precisely in the form of a problem. We should speak of a dialectics of the calculus rather than a metaphysics. By dialectic we do not mean any kind of circulation of opposing representations which would make them coincide in the identity of a concept, but the problem element in so far as this may be distinguished from the properly mathematical element of solutions. Following Lautmann's general theses, a problem has three aspects: its difference in kind from ideas and the synthesis of difference 179 solutions, its transcendence in relation to the solutions that it engenders on the basis of its own determinant conditions, and its immanence in the solutions which cover it, the problem being the better resolved the more it is determined. Thus the ideal connections constitutive of the problematic, dialectical, idea are incarnated in the real relations which are constituted by mathematical theories and carried over into problems in the form of solutions. We have seen how all three of these aspects were present in the differential calculus. The solutions are like the discontinuities compatible with differential equations, engendered on the basis of an ideal continuity in accordance with the conditions of the problem. However, an important point must be specified. Differential calculus obviously belongs to mathematics, it is an entirely mathematical instrument. It would therefore seem difficult to see in it the Platonic evidence of a dialectic superior to mathematics. At least, it would be difficult if the immanent aspect of problems did not offer an adequate explanation. Problems are always dialectical, the dialectic has no other sense, nor do problems have any other sense. What is mathematical, or physical, biological, psychical, or sociological, are the solutions. It is true, however, that on the one hand the nature of the solutions refers to different orders of problem within the dialectic itself, and on the other hand that problems, by virtue of their immanence, which is no less essential than their transcendence, express themselves technically in the domain of solutions to which they give rise by virtue of their dialectical order. Just as the right angle and the circle are duplicated by ruler and compass, so each dialectical problem is duplicated by a symbolic field in which it is expressed. That is why it must be said that there are mathematical, physical, biological, psychical, and sociological problems, even though every problem is dialectical by nature and there are no non-dialectical problems. Mathematics, therefore, does not include only solutions to problems, it also includes the expression of problems relative to the field of solvability which they define, and define by virtue of their very dialectical order. That is why the differential calculus belongs entirely to mathematics, even at the very moment when it finds its sense in the revelation of a dialectic which points beyond mathematics. We cannot even suppose that, from a technical point of view, differential calculus is the only mathematical expression of problems as such. The methods of exhaustion played this role in very diverse domains, as did analytic geometry. More recently, Other procedures have fulfilled this role better. Recall the circle in which the theory of problems was caught. A problem is solvable only to the extent that it is true, but we always tend to define the truth of a problem in terms of its solvability. Instead of basing the extrinsic criterion of solvability upon the internal character of the problem, idea, we make the internal character depend upon the simple external criterion. Now, the mathematician Abel was perhaps the first to break this circle. He elaborated a whole method according to which 180 difference and repetition solvability must follow from the form of the problem. Instead of seeking to find out by trial and error whether a given equation is solvable in general, we must determine the conditions of the problem which progressively specify the fields of solvability in such a way that the statement contains the seeds of the solution. This is a radical reversal in the problem-solution relation, a more considerable revolution than the Copernican. It has been said that Abel thereby inaugurated a new critique of pure reason, in particular going beyond Kantian extrinsicism. This same judgment is confirmed in relation to the work of Deleuze. Starting from a basic field, R, successive adjunct ions to this field, R, allow a progressively more precise distinction of the roots of an equation, by the progressive limitation of possible substitutions. There is thus a succession of partial resolvents or an embedding of groups which make the solution follow from the very conditions of the problem. The fact that an equation cannot be solved algebraically, for example, is no longer discovered as a result of empirical research or by trial and error, but as a result of the characteristics of the groups and partial resolvents which constitute the synthesis of the problem and its conditions. An equation is solvable only by algebraic means, in other words, by radicals, when the partial resolvents are binomial equations and the indices of the groups are prime numbers. The theory of problems is completely transformed and at last grounded, since we are no longer in the classic master-pupil situation where the pupil understands and follows a problem only to the extent that the master already knows the solution and provides the necessary adjunct ions. For, as Georges Various remarks, the group of an equation does not characterize at a given moment what we know about its roots, but the objectivity of what we do not know about them. Conversely, this non-knowledge is no longer a negative or an insufficiency but a rule or something to be learnt which corresponds to a fundamental dimension of the object. The whole pedagogical relation is transformed, a new may know, but many other things along with it, including knowledge and sufficient reason. Deleuze's progressive discernibility unites in the same continuous movement the processes of reciprocal determination and complete determination, pairs of roots and the distinction between roots within a pair. It constitutes the total figure of sufficient reason, into which it introduces time. With Abel and Deleuze, the mathematical theory of problems is able to fulfill all its properly dialectical requirements, and to break the circle in which it was caught. Modern mathematics is therefore regarded as based upon the theory of groups or set theory rather than upon differential calculus. Nevertheless, it is no accident that Abel's method concerned above all the integration of differential formulae. What matters to us is less the determination of this or that break coupure in the history of mathematics, analytic geometry, differential calculus, group theory, than the manner in which, at each ideas and the synthesis of difference 181 moment of that history, dialectical problems, their mathematical expression and the simultaneous origin of their fields of solvability are interrelated. From this point of view, there is a continuity and a teleology in the development of mathematics which makes the differences in kind between differential calculus and other instruments merely secondary. Calculus recognizes differentials of different orders. However, the notions of differential and order accord with the dialectic in a quite different manner. The problematic or dialectical idea is a system of connections between differential elements, a system of differential relations between genetic elements. There are different orders of ideas presupposed by one another according to the ideal nature of these relations and the elements considered, ideas of ideas, etc. There is as yet nothing mathematical in these definitions. Mathematics appears with the fields of solution in which dialectical ideas of the last order are incarnated, and with the expression of problems relative to these fields. Other orders of ideas are incarnated in other fields and in other modes of expression corresponding to different sciences. In this manner, a genesis of diverse scientific domains takes place on the basis of dialectical problems and their orders. Differential calculus in the most precise sense is only a mathematical instrument which, even in its own domain, does not necessarily represent the most complete form of the expression of problems and the constitution of their solutions in relation to the order of dialectical ideas which it incarnates. It nevertheless has a wider universal sense in which it designates the composite whole that includes problems or dialectical ideas, the scientific expression of problems, and the establishment of fields of solution. More generally, we must conclude that there is no difficulty with any supposed application of mathematics to other domains, in particular with regard to differential calculus or group theory. It is rather that each engendered domain, in which dialectical ideas of this or that order are incarnated, possesses its own calculus. Ideas always have an element of quantitability, qualitability, and potentiality. There are always processes of determinability, of reciprocal determination and complete determination, always distributions of distinctive and ordinary points, always adjunct fields which form the synthetic progression of a sufficient reason. There is no metaphor here, except the metaphor consubstantial with the notion of ideas, that of the dialectical transport or diaphora. Herein lies the adventure of ideas. It is not mathematics which is applied to other domains but the dialectic which establishes for its problems, by virtue of their order and their conditions, the direct differential calculus corresponding or appropriate to the domain under consideration. In this sense there is a mathesis universalis corresponding to the universality of the dialectic. If ideas are the differentials of thought, there is a differential calculus corresponding to each idea, an alphabet of what it means to think. Differential calculus is not the unimaginative calculus of the utilitarian, the crude arithmetic 182 difference and repetition calculus which subordinates thought to other things or to other ends, but the algebra of pure thought, the superior irony of problems themselves, the only calculus beyond good and evil. This entire adventurous character of ideas remains to be described. Ideas are multiplicities, every idea is a multiplicity or a variety. In this Riemannian usage of the word multiplicity, taken up by Husserl, and again by Bergson, the utmost importance must be attached to the substantive form. Multiplicity must not designate a combination of the many and the one, but rather an organization belonging to the many as such, which has no need whatsoever of unity in order to form a system. The one and the many are concepts of the understanding which make up the overly loose mesh of a distorted dialectic which proceeds by opposition. The biggest fish pass through. Can we believe that the concrete is attained when the inadequacy of an abstraction is compensated for by the inadequacy of its opposite? We can say the one is multiple, the multiple one forever. We speak like Plato's young men who did not even spare the farmyard. Contraries may be combined, contradictions established, but at no point has the essential been raised. How many, how, in which cases? The essence is nothing, an empty generality, when separated from this measure, this manner, and this study of cases. Predicates may be combined, but the idea is missed, the outcome is an empty discourse which lacks a substantive. Multiplicity, which replaces the one no less than the multiple, is the true substantive, substance itself. The variable multiplicity is the how many, the how and each of the cases. Everything is a multiplicity in so far as it incarnates an idea. Even the many is a multiplicity, even the one is a multiplicity. That the one is a multiplicity, as Bergson and Husserl showed, is enough to reject back-to-back adjectival propositions of the one many and many one type. Everywhere the differences between multiplicities and the differences within multiplicities replace schematic and crude oppositions. Instead of the enormous opposition between the one and the many, there is only the variety of multiplicity, in other words, difference. It is, perhaps, ironic to say that everything is multiplicity, even the one, even the many. However, irony itself is a multiplicity, or rather, the art of multiplicities, the art of grasping the ideas and the problems they incarnate in things, and of grasping things as incarnations, as cases of solution for the problems of ideas. An idea is an n-dimensional, continuous, defined multiplicity. Color, or rather, the idea of color, is a three-dimensional multiplicity. By dimensions, we mean the variables or coordinates upon which a phenomenon depends. By continuity, we mean the set of relations between changes in these variables, for example, a quadratic form of the differentials of the coordinates. By definition, we mean the elements' ideas and the synthesis of difference 183 reciprocally determined by these relations, elements which cannot change unless the multiplicity changes its order and its metric. When and under what conditions should we speak of a multiplicity? There are three conditions which together allow us to define the moment at which an idea emerges. 1. The elements of the multiplicity must have neither sensible form nor conceptual signification, nor, therefore, any assignable function. They are not even actually existent, but inseparable from a potential or a virtuality. In this sense they imply no prior identity, no positing of a something that could be called one or the same. On the contrary, their intermination renders possible the manifestation of difference freed from all subordination. 2. These elements must in effect be determined, but reciprocally, by reciprocal relations which allow no independence whatsoever to subsist. Such relations are precisely non-localizable ideal connections, whether they characterize the multiplicity globally or proceed by the juxtaposition of neighboring regions. In all cases the multiplicity is intrinsically defined, without external reference or recourse to a uniform space in which it would be submerged. Spatiotemporal relations no doubt retain multiplicity, but lose interiority. Concepts of the understanding retain interiority, but lose multiplicity, which they replace by the identity of an I think or something thought. Internal multiplicity, by contrast, is characteristic of the idea alone. 3. A multiple ideal connection, a differential relation, must be actualized in diverse spatiotemporal relationships, at the same time as its elements are actually incarnated in a variety of terms and forms. The idea is thus defined as a structure. A structure or an idea is a complex theme, an internal multiplicity, in other words, a system of multiple, non-localizable connections between differential elements which is incarnated in real relations and actual terms. In this sense, we see no difficulty in reconciling genesis and structure. Following Lautmann and Wheelman's work on mathematics, structuralism seems to us the only means by which a genetic method can achieve its ambitions. It is sufficient to understand that the genesis takes place in time not between one actual term, however small, and another actual term, but between the virtual and its actualization. In other words, it goes from the structure to its incarnation, from the conditions of a problem to the cases of solution, from the differential elements and their ideal connections to actual terms and diverse real relations which constitute at each moment the actuality of time. This is a genesis without dynamism, evolving necessarily in the element of a suprahistoricity, a static genesis which may be understood as the correlate of the notion of passive synthesis, and which in turn illuminates that notion. Was not the mistake of the modern interpretation of calculus to condemn its genetic ambitions under the pretext of having discovered a structure which dissociated calculus from any phronemic or dynamic considerations? There are ideas which correspond to mathematical relations and realities, others which 184 difference and repetition correspond to physical laws and facts. There are others which, according to their order, correspond to organisms, psychic structures, languages, and societies. These correspondences without resemblance are of a structural genetic nature. Just as structure is independent of any principle of identity, so genesis is independent of a rule of resemblance. However, an idea with all its adventures emerges in so far as it already satisfies certain structural and genetic conditions, and not others. The application of these criteria must therefore be sought in very different domains, by means of examples chosen almost at random. First example, atomism as a physical idea. Ancient atomism not only multiplied Parmenidean being, it also conceived of ideas as multiplicities of atoms, atoms being the objective elements of thought. Thereafter it is indeed essential that atoms be related to other atoms at the heart of structures which are actualized in sensible composites. In this regard, the clinamen is by no means a change of direction in the movement of an atom, much less an indetermination testifying to the existence of a physical freedom. It is the original determination of the direction of movement, the synthesis of movement and its direction which relates one atom to another. Incerto tempore does not mean undetermined but non-assignable or non-localizable. If it is true that atoms, the elements of thought, move as rapidly as thought itself, as Epicurus says in his letter to Herodotus, then the clinamen is the reciprocal determination which is produced in a time smaller than the minimum continuous time thinkable. It is not surprising that Epicurus makes use here of the vocabulary of exhaustion. There is something analogous in the clinamen to a relation between the differentials of atoms in movement. There is a declination here which also forms the language of thought, there is something here in thought which testifies to a limit of thought, but on the basis of which it thinks, faster than thought, in a time smaller. Nevertheless, the Epicurean atom still retains too much independence, a shape, and an actuality. Reciprocal determination here still has too much of the aspect of a spatiotemporal relation. The question whether modern atomism, by contrast, fulfills all the conditions of a structure must be posed in relation to the differential equations which determine the laws of nature, in relation to the types of multiple and non-iocalisable connections established between particles, and in relation to the character of the potentiality expressly attributed to these particles. Second example, the organism as biological idea. Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire seems to be the first to have defended the consideration of elements that he called abstract, taken independently of their forms and their functions. This is why he criticized not only his predecessors but also his contemporaries, Cuvier, for not going beyond an empirical distribution of differences and resemblances. These purely anatomical and atomic elements, such as ideas and the synthesis of difference 185 small bones, are linked by ideal relations of reciprocal determination, they thereby constitute an essence which is the animal in itself. It is these differential relations between pure anatomical elements which are incarnated in diverse animal configurations, with their diverse organs and functions. Such is the threefold character of anatomy: atomic, comparative, and transcendent. In his Notions synthetiques et historiques de philosophie naturelle, 1837, Geoffroy spells out his dream which, he says, was also that of the young Napoleon, to be the Newton of the infinitely small, to discover the world of details or very short distance ideal connections beneath the cruder play of sensible and conceptual differences and resemblances. An organism is a set of real terms and relations, dimension, position, number, which actualizes on its own account, to this or that degree, relations between differential elements. For example, the hyoid of a cat has 9 small bones, whereas in man it has only 5, the other 4 are found towards the skull, outside the organ, reduced in this way by the upright position. The genesis of development in organisms must therefore be understood as the actualization of an essence, in accordance with reasons and at speeds determined by the environment, with accelerations and interruptions, but independently of any transformist passage from one actual term to another. Such is the genius of Geoffroy. Here too, however, the question of a structuralism in biology, in accordance with the word structure, which Geoffroy often employed, depends upon the ultimate determination of the differential elements and of the type of relations between them. Are anatomical elements, principally bones, capable of fulfilling this role, as though the necessity for muscles did not set limits to their relations, and as though these elements did not themselves still enjoy an actual, or too actual, existence? It may be, then, that structure reappears on a quite different level, with a completely new determination of differential elements and ideal connections. This occurs with genetics. There are perhaps as many differences between genetics and Geoffroy as there are between modern atomism and Epicurus. Nevertheless, chromosomes appear as loci, in other words, not simply as places in space but as complexes of relations of proximity. Genes express differential elements which also characterize an organism in a global manner, and play the role of distinctive points in a double process of reciprocal and complete determination. The double aspect of genes involves commanding several characteristics at once, and acting only in relation to other genes. The whole constitutes a virtuality, a potentiality, and this structure is incarnated in actual organisms, as much from the point of view of the determination of their species as from that of the differentiation of their parts, according to rhythms that are precisely called differential, according to comparative speeds or slownesses which measure the movement of actualization. 186 Difference and repetition. Third example, are there social ideas, in a Marxist sense? In what Marx calls abstract labor, abstraction is made from the particular qualities of the products of labor and the qualities of the laborers, but not from the conditions of productivity, the labor power and the means of labor in a society. The social idea is the element of quantitability, qualitability, and potentiality of societies. It expresses a system of multiple ideal connections, or differential relations between differential elements. These include relations of production and property, relations which are established not between concrete individuals but between atomic bearers of labor power or representatives of property. The economic instance is constituted by such a social multiplicity, in other words, by the varieties of these differential relations. Such a variety of relations, with its corresponding distinctive points, is then incarnated in the concrete differentiated labors which characterize a determinate society, in the real relations of that society, juridical, political, ideological, and in the actual terms of those relations, for example, capitalist Wage-Bearer. Althusser and his collaborators are, therefore, profoundly correct in showing the presence of a genuine structure in capital, and in rejecting historicist interpretations of Marxism, since this structure never acts transitively, following the order of succession in time. Rather, it acts by incarnating its varieties in diverse societies and by accounting for the simultaneity of all the relations and terms which, each time and in each case, constitute the present. That is why the economic is never given properly speaking, but rather designates a differential virtuality to be interpreted, always covered over by its forms of actualization, a theme or problematic always covered over by its cases of solution. In short, the economic is the social dialectic itself, in other words, the totality of the problems posed to a given society, or the synthetic and problematizing field of that society. In all rigor, there are only economic social problems, even though the solutions may be juridical, political, or ideological, and the problems may be expressed in these fields of resolvability. The famous phrase of the contribution to the critique of political economy, "Mankind always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve," does not mean that the problems are only apparent or that they are already solved, but, on the contrary, that the economic conditions of a problem determine or give rise to the manner in which it finds a solution within the framework of the real relations of the society. Not that the observer can draw the least optimism from this, for these solutions may involve stupidity or cruelty, the horror of war or the solution of the Jewish problem. More precisely, the solution is always that which a society deserves or gives rise to as a consequence of the manner in which, given its real relations, it is able to pose the problems set within it and to it by the differential relations it incarnates. Ideas are complexes of coexistence. In a certain sense all ideas coexist, but ideas and the synthesis of difference. 187 They do so at points, on the edges, and under glimmerings which never have the uniformity of a natural light. On each occasion, obscurities and zones of shadow correspond to their distinction. Ideas are distinguished from one another, but not at all in the same manner as forms and the terms in which these are incarnated. They are objectively made and unmade according to the conditions which determine their fluent synthesis. This is because they combine the greatest power of being differentiated with an inability to be differentiated. Ideas are varieties which include in themselves subvarieties. We can distinguish three dimensions of variety. In the first, vertical dimension we can distinguish ordinal varieties according to the nature of the elements and the differential relations, for example, mathematical, mathematico-physical, chemical, biological, physical, sociological and linguistic ideas. Each level implies differentials of a different dialectical order, but the elements of one order can pass over into those of another under new relations, either by being dissolved in the larger superior order or by being reflected in the inferior order. In the second, horizontal dimension we can distinguish characteristic varieties corresponding to the degrees of a differential relation within a given order, and to the distribution of singular points for each degree, such as the equation for conic sections which gives according to the case an ellipse, a hyperbola, a parabola, or a straight line, or the varieties of animal ordered from the point of view of unity of composition, or the varieties of language ordered from the point of view of their phonological system. Finally, in depth we can distinguish axiomatic varieties which determine a common axiom for differential relations of a different order, on condition that this axiom itself coincides with a third-order differential relation, for example, the addition of real numbers and the composition of displacements, or, in an altogether different domain, the weaving speech practiced by the Grille-Dogons. Ideas and the distinctions between ideas are inseparable from their types of varieties, and from the manner in which each type enters into the others. We propose the term perplication to designate this distinctive and coexistent state of ideas. Not that the corresponding connotation of perplexity signifies a coefficient of doubt, hesitation, or astonishment, or anything whatsoever incomplete about ideas themselves. On the contrary, it is a question of the identity of ideas and problems, of the exhaustively problematic character of ideas, in other words, of the manner in which problems are objectively determined by their conditions to participate in one another according to the circumstantial requirements of the synthesis of ideas. Ideas are by no means essences. In so far as they are the objects of ideas, problems belong on the side of events, affections, or accidents rather than on that of theorematic essences. Ideas are developed in the auxiliaries and the adjunct fields by which their synthetic power is measured. Consequently, the domain of ideas is that of the inessential. They proclaim their affinity with the inessential in a manner as deliberate and as fiercely 188 difference and repetition obstinate as that in which rationalism proclaimed its possession and comprehension of essences. Rationalism wanted to tie the fate of ideas to abstract and dead essences, and to the extent that the problematic form of ideas was recognized, it even wanted that form tied to the question of essences, in other words, to the what is X. How many misunderstandings are contained in this will? It is true that Plato employs this question in order to refute those who content themselves with offering empirical responses, and to oppose essence and appearance. His aim, however, is to silence the empirical responses in order to open up the indeterminate horizon of a transcendental problem which is the object of an idea. Once it is a question of determining the problem or the idea as such, once it is a question of setting the dialectic in motion, the question what is X, gives way to other questions, otherwise powerful and efficacious, otherwise imperative, how much, how, and in what cases. The question what is X, animates only the so-called aporetic dialogues, in other words, those in which the very form of the question gives rise to contradiction and leads to nihilism, no doubt because they have only propedeutic aims, the aim of opening up the region of the problem in general, leaving to other procedures the task of determining it as a problem or as an idea. When Socratic irony was taken seriously and the dialectic as a whole was confused with its propedeutic, extremely troublesome consequences followed, for the dialectic ceased to be the science of problems and ultimately became confused with the simple movement of the negative, and of contradiction. Philosophers began to talk like young men from the farmyard. From this point of view, Hegel is the culmination of a long tradition which took the question what is X, seriously and used it to determine ideas as essences, but in so doing substituted the negative for the nature of the problematic. This was the outcome of a distortion of the dialectic. Moreover, how many theological prejudices were involved in that tradition, since the answer to what is X, is always God as the locus of the comminatory of abstract predicates. It should be noticed how few philosophers have placed their trust in the question what is X, in order to have ideas. Certainly not Aristotle. Once the dialectic brews up its matter instead of being applied in a vacuum for propedeutic ends, the questions how much, how, in what cases, and who, abound, questions the function and sense of which we shall see below. Point 12. These questions are those of the accident, the event, the multiplicity, of difference, as opposed to that of the essence, or that of the one, or those of the contrary and the contradictory. Hippias triumphs everywhere, even already in Plato, Hippias who refused essences, but nevertheless did not content himself with examples. Problems are of the order of events, not only because cases of solution emerge like real events, but because the conditions of a problem themselves imply events such as sections, ablations, adjunct ions. In this sense, it is ideas and the synthesis of difference. 189 correct to represent a double series of events which develop on two planes, echoing without resembling each other, real events on the level of the engendered solutions, and ideal events embedded in the conditions of the problem, like the acts, or, rather, the dreams, of the gods who double our history. The ideal series enjoys the double property of transcendence and immanence in relation to the real. In effect, we have seen how the existence and distribution of singular points belongs entirely to the idea, even though their specification was immanent in the solution curves of their neighboring regions, or, in other words, in the real relations in which the idea is incarnated. In his wonderful description of the event, P. Guy deployed two lines, one horizontal and another vertical, which repeated in depth the distinctive points corresponding to the first, and even anticipated and eternally engendered these distinctive points and their incarnation in the first. At the intersection of these lines, where a powder fuse forms the link between the idea and the actual, the temporally eternal is formed, and our greatest mastery or greatest power is decided, that which concerns problems themselves. Suddenly, we felt that we were no longer the same convicts. Nothing had happened. Yet a problem in which a whole world collided, a problem without issue, in which no end could be seen, suddenly ceased to exist, and we asked ourselves what we had been talking about. Instead of an ordinary solution, a found solution, this problem, this difficulty, this impossibility had just passed what seemed like a physical point of resolution. A crisis point. At the same time, the whole world had passed what seemed like a physical crisis point. There are critical points of the event just as there are critical points of temperature, points of fusion, freezing and boiling points, points of coagulation and crystallization. There are even in the case of events states of superfusion which are precipitated, crystallized, or determined only by the introduction of a fragment of some future event. Point 13. For this reason, the procedure capable of following and describing multiplicities and themes, the procedure of vice diction, is more important than that of contradiction, which purports to determine essences and preserve their simplicity. It will be said that the essence is by nature the most important thing. This, however, is precisely what is at issue, whether the notions of importance and non-importance are not precisely notions which concern events or accidents, and are much more important within accidents than the crude opposition between essence and accident itself. The problem of thought is tied not to essences but to the evaluation of what is important and what is not, to the distribution of singular and regular, distinctive and ordinary points, which takes place entirely within the inessential or within the description of a multiplicity, in relation to the ideal events which constitute the conditions of a problem. To have an idea means number 190 difference and repetition. More than this, and erroneousness or stupidity is defined above all by its perpetual confusion with regard to the important and the unimportant, the ordinary and the singular. It is vice diction which engenders cases, on the basis of auxiliaries and adjunct ions. It presides over the distribution of distinctive points within the idea, it decides the manner in which a series must be continued, from one singular point among regular points up to which other. It determines whether the series obtained within the idea are convergent or divergent. There are therefore singularities which are themselves ordinary because of the convergence of the series, and singularities which are distinctive because of their divergence. Vice diction has two procedures which intervene both in the determination of the conditions of the problem and in the correlative genesis of cases of solution. These are, in the first case, the specification of adjunct fields and, in the second, the condensation of singularities. On the one hand, in the progressive determination of the conditions, we must in effect discover the adjunct ions which complete the initial field of the problem as such, in other words, the varieties of the multiplicity in all its dimensions, the fragments of ideal future or past events which, by the same token, render the problem solvable, and we must establish the modality in which these enclose or are connected with the initial field. On the other hand, we must condense all the singularities, precipitate all the circumstances, points of fusion, congelation, or condensation in a sublime occasion, kairos, which makes the solution explode like something abrupt, brutal, and revolutionary. Having an idea is this as well. It is as though every idea has two faces, which are like love and anger, love in the search for fragments, the progressive determination and linking of the ideal adjoint fields, anger in the condensation of singularities which, by dint of ideal events, defines the concentration of a revolutionary situation and causes the idea to explode into the actual. It is in this sense that Lenin had ideas. There is an objectivity on the part of adjunction and condensation, and an objectivity of conditions, which implies that ideas no more than problems do not exist only in our heads but occur here and there in the production of an actual historical world. Furthermore, we must not see mathematical metaphors in all these expressions such as singular and distinctive points, adjunct fields, and condensation of singularities, nor physical metaphors in points of fusion or congelation, nor lyrical or mystical metaphors in love and anger. These are categories of the dialectical idea, the extensions of the differential calculus, mathesis universalis, but also universal physics, universal psychology, and universal sociology, corresponding to the idea in all its domains of multiplicity. They are what is amorous or revolutionary in every idea, that by virtue of which ideas are always unequal glimmers of love and wrath which have nothing in common with any natural light. The most important aspect of Schelling's philosophy is his consideration of powers. How unjust, in this respect, is Hegel's critical remark about the ideas and the synthesis of difference 191 black cows. Of these two philosophers, it is Schelling who brings difference out of the night of the identical, and with finer, more varied, and more terrifying flashes of lightning than those of contradiction, with progressivity. Anger and love are powers of the idea which develop on the basis of a meon, in other words, not from a negative or a non-being akon but from a problematic being or non-existent, a being implicit in those existences beyond the ground. The god of love and the god of anger are required in order to have an idea. A2, A3 form the play of pure depotentialization and potentiality, testifying to the presence in Schelling's philosophy of a differential calculus adequate to the dialectic. Schelling was Leibnizian, but also Neoplatonic. The great Neoplatonic fantasy which offered a response to the problem of the Phaedrus, stacking or embedding types of Zeus by a method of exhaustion and evolution of powers, Zeus, Zeus 2, Zeus 3. It is here that division finds its scope, which is not in breadth in the differentiation of species within the same genus, but in depth in derivation and potentialization, already a kind of differentiation. Thus, in a serial dialectic, the powers of a difference which draws together and assembles ho synechikos are awakened and become titanic with anger, demiurgic with love, and even Apolloniac, Aritic, and Athena. 14. There is no more opposition between event and structure or sense and structure than there is between structure and genesis. Structures include as many ideal events as they do varieties of relations and singular points, which intersect with the real events they determine. Those systems of differential elements and relations which we call structures are also senses from a genetic point of view, with regard to the actual terms and relations in which they are incarnated. The true opposition lies elsewhere, between idea, structure, event, sense, and representation. With representation, concepts are like possibilities, but the subject of representation still determines the object as really conforming to the concept, as an essence. That is why representation as a whole is the element of knowledge which is realized by the recollection of the thought object and its recognition by a thinking subject. The idea makes a virtue of quite different characteristics. The virtuality of the idea has nothing to do with possibility. Multiplicity tolerates no dependence on the identical in the subject or in the object. The events and singularities of the idea do not allow any positing of an essence as what the thing is. No doubt, if one insists, the word essence might be preserved, but only on condition of saying that the essence is precisely the accident, the event, the sense, not simply the contrary of what is ordinarily called the essence but the contrary of the contrary. Multiplicity is no more appearance than essence, no more multiple than one. The procedures of vice diction cannot, therefore, be expressed in terms of representation, even infinite, as we saw with Leibniz. They thereby lose their principal power. 192 Difference and repetition that of affirming divergence or decentering. In fact, the idea is not the element of knowledge but that of an infinite learning, which is of a different nature to knowledge. For learning evolves entirely in the comprehension of problems as such, in the apprehension and condensation of singularities and in the composition of ideal events and bodies. Learning to swim or learning a foreign language means composing the singular points of one's own body or one's own language with those of another shape or element, which tears us apart but also propels us into a hitherto unknown and unheard of world of problems. To what are we dedicated if not to those problems which demand the very transformation of our body and our language? In short, representation and knowledge are modeled entirely upon propositions of consciousness which designate cases of solution, but those propositions by themselves give a completely inaccurate notion of the instance which engenders them as cases, and which they resolve or conclude. By contrast, the idea and learning express that extra-propositional or sub-representative problematic instance, the presentation of the unconscious, not the representation of consciousness. It is not surprising that, among many of the authors who promote it, structuralism is so often accompanied by calls for a new theater or a new, non-Aristotelian, interpretation of the theater, a theater of multiplicities opposed in every respect to the theater of representation, which leaves intact neither the identity of the thing represented, nor author, nor spectator, nor character, nor representation which, through the vicissitudes of the play, can become the object of a production of knowledge or final recognition. Instead, a theatry of problems and always open questions which draws spectator, setting and characters into the real movement of an apprenticeship of the entire unconscious, the final elements of which remain the problems themselves. How should the necessarily unconscious nature of ideas be understood? Must it be supposed that ideas are the objects of a particular exclusive faculty, and that to the extent that they cannot be grasped by its empirical exercise they expose the transcendent or limit element of that faculty? This hypothesis would already have the advantage of eliminating reason or even the understanding as the faculty of ideas, and more generally of eliminating every faculty constitutive of a common sense under which is subsumed the empirical exercise of the other faculties with regard to a supposed same object. It is incomprehensible only from the point of view of a common sense or that of an exercise traced from the empirical that, for example, thought should find within itself something which it cannot think, something which is both unthinkable and that which must be thought. According to an objection often made against metaphysics, ideas, understood as the differentials of thought, themselves introduce a minimum of given which cannot be thought. They restore the duality of infinite and finite understanding, which function respectively as the conditions of existence and the conditions of knowledge, and which the ideas and the synthesis of difference 193 entire Kantian critique nevertheless propose to eliminate. This objection, however, applies only to the extent that the faculty of ideas according to Maimon is the understanding, just as it was reason according to Kant, that is, in either case, a faculty which constitutes a common sense and cannot tolerate the presence within itself of a kernel on which the empirical exercise of the conjoint faculties would break. It is only under these conditions that the unthought in thought, the unconscious of a pure thought, must be realized in an infinite understanding which serves as the ideal of knowledge, and that the differentials are condemned to the status of mere fictions unless they acquire the status of a fully actual reality in that infinite understanding. Once again, however, the alternative is false. We might as well say that the specificity of the problematic and the presence of the unconscious in finite thought remain misunderstood. This is no longer so when ideas are related to the transcendent exercise of a particular faculty liberated from any common sense. However, we do not believe this first response to be sufficient, nor that ideas and structures refer to a particular faculty. Ideas occur throughout the faculties and concern them all. According to the place and the existence of a faculty determined as such, they render possible both the differential object and the transcendent exercise of that faculty. Take, for example, the linguistic multiplicity, regarded as a virtual system of reciprocal connections between phonemes which is incarnated in the actual terms and relations of diverse languages. Such a multiplicity renders possible speech as a faculty as well as the transcendent object of that speech, that meta-language which cannot be spoken in the empirical usage of a given language, but must be spoken and can be spoken only in the poetic usage of speech coextensive with virtuality. Take the social multiplicity, it determines sociability as a faculty, but also the transcendent object of sociability which cannot be lived within actual societies in which the multiplicity is incarnated, but must be and can be lived only in the element of social upheaval, in other words, freedom, which is always hidden among the remains of an old order and the first fruits of a new. The same could be said for other ideas or multiplicities, the psychic multiplicities of imagination and fantasy, the biological multiplicities of vitality and monstrosity, the physical multiplicities of sensibility and sign. In this manner, ideas correspond in turn to each of the faculties and are not the exclusive object of any one in particular, not even of thought. The essential point is that in this way we do not reintroduce any form of common sense, quite the contrary. We saw how the discord between the faculties, which followed from the exclusive character of the transcendent object apprehended by each, nevertheless implied a harmony such that each transmits its violence to the other by powder fuse, but precisely a discordant harmony which excludes the forms of identity, convergence, and collaboration which define a common sense. This harmonious discord 194 difference and repetition seem to us to correspond to that difference which by itself articulates or draws together. There is thus a point at which thinking, speaking, imagining, feeling, etc., are one and the same thing, but that thing affirms only the divergence of the faculties in their transcendent exercise. It is a question, therefore, not of a common sense but, on the contrary, of a parasense, in the sense that paradox is also the contrary of good sense. The elements of this parasense are ideas, precisely because ideas are pure multiplicities which do not presuppose any form of identity in a common sense but, on the contrary, animate and describe the disjoint exercise of the faculties from a transcendental point of view. Ideas are thus multiplicities with differential glimmers, like will-o'-the-wisps, virtual trails of fire, from one faculty to another, without ever having the homogeneity of that natural light which characterizes common sense. That is why learning may be defined in two complementary ways, both of which are opposed to representation in knowledge. Learning is either a matter of penetrating the idea, its varieties and distinctive points, or a matter of raising a faculty to its disjoint transcendent exercise, raising it to that encounter and that violence which are communicated to the others. That is also why the unconscious has two complementary determinations which necessarily exclude it from representation but render it worthy and capable of a pure presentation. The unconscious may be defined either by the extra-propositional and non-actual character of ideas in the parasense, or by the non-empirical character of the paradoxical exercise of the faculties. It is nevertheless true that ideas have a very special relationship to pure thought. Thought here must undoubtedly be regarded not as the form of identity of all the faculties but as a particular faculty defined in the same manner as the others by its differential object and its separate exercise. The parasense or violence which is communicated from one faculty to another according to an order then assigns a particular place to thought, Thought is determined in such a manner that it grasps its own cogitandum only at the extremity of the fuse of violence which, from one idea to another, first sets in motion sensibility and its sentiendum, and so on. This extremity might just as well be regarded as the ultimate origin of ideas. In what sense, however, should we understand ultimate origin? In this same sense, while the opposition between thought and all forms of common sense remains stronger than ever, ideas must be called differentials of thought, or the unconscious of pure thought. Ideas, therefore, are related not to a cogito which functions as ground or as a proposition of consciousness, but to the fractured I of a dissolved cogito, in other words, to the universal ungrounding which characterizes thought as a faculty in its transcendental exercise. Ideas are not the object of a particular faculty, but nevertheless particularly concern a special faculty to the point that one can say, they come from it, in order to constitute the parasense of all the faculties. Once again, what does come from or find its origin mean here? Where ideas and the synthesis of difference 195 do ideas come from, where do problems, their elements and ideal relations come from? The time has come to determine the difference between the two instances of the problem and the question that we have until now left vague. It must be remembered to what extent modern thought and the renaissance of ontology is based upon the question-problem complex. This complex has ceased to be considered the expression of a provisional and subjective state in the representation of knowledge in order to become the intentionality of being par excellence, the only instance to which, properly speaking, being answers without the question thereby becoming lost or overtaken. On the contrary, it alone has an opening coextensive with that which must respond to it and can respond to it only by retaining, repeating, and continually going over it. This conception of the ontological scope of the question animates works of art as much as philosophical thought. Works are developed around or on the basis of a fracture that they never succeed in filling. The fact that the novel, particularly since Joyce, has found a new language in the mode of an inquiry or questionnaire and presents essentially problematic events and characters obviously does not mean that nothing is certain. It is obviously not the application of a generalist method of doubt nor the sign of a modern scepticism but, on the contrary, the discovery of the question and the problematic as a transcendental horizon, as the transcendental element which belongs essentially to beings, things, and events. It is the novelistic or theatrical or musical or philosophical, etc., discovery of the idea, and at the same time the discovery of a transcendent exercise of sensibility, of image memory, language and thought, by means of which each of these faculties communicates in full discordance with the others and opens onto the difference of being by taking its own difference as object, in other words, by posing the question of its own difference. Hence that form of writing which is nothing but the question what is writing, or that sensibility which is nothing but the question what is it to sense, or that thought which asks what does it mean to think. These give rise to the greatest monotonies and the greatest weaknesses of a newfound common sense in the absence of the genius of the idea, but also to the most powerful repetitions, the most prodigious inventions in the parasense when the idea emerges in all its violence. Let us recall the mere principles of this ontology of the question. 1. Far from being an empirical state of knowledge destined to disappear in the response once a response is given, the question silences all empirical responses which purport to suppress it, in order to force the one response which always continues and maintains it, like Job, in his insistence upon a first-hand response which becomes confused with the question itself. First power of the absurd. 2. Whence the power of the question to put in play the questioner as much as that which is questioned, and to put itself in question. Oedipus and his manner of 196 difference and repetition never being finished with the Sphinx. Second power of the enigma. 3. Whence the revelation of being as corresponding to the question, reducible neither to the questioned nor to the questioner but that which unites both in the articulation of its own difference, a me on which is neither non-being non-etre nor the being of the negative, but non-being non-hant or the being of the question, Ulysses and the response no one. Third power, which is that of the philosophical Odyssey. This modern ontology nevertheless remains inadequate. It sometimes plays upon the indeterminate as an objective power of the question, only to introduce a subjective emptiness which is then attributed to being, thereby substituting for the force of repetition the impoverishment of the already said or the stereotypes of a new common sense. Sometimes it even manages to dissociate the complex, thereby entrusting questions to the religiosity of a beautiful soul while relegating problems to the status of external obstacles. However, what would a question be if it were not developed under the auspices of those problematizing fields alone capable of determining it within a characteristic science? The beautiful soul never ceases to pose its own question, that of betrothal, but how many fiancés were abandoned or disappeared once the question found its right problem, which then reacts upon it, corrects it, and displaces it with all the difference of a thought, thus Proust's hero asking "Will I marry Albertine?" but developing the question in the problem of the work of art to be undertaken, where the very question undergoes a radical metamorphosis. We must investigate the manner in which questions develop into problems within ideas, how problems are enveloped by questions within thought. Here too, the classical image of thought must be confronted with another image, this one suggested by the contemporary renaissance of ontology. From Plato to the post-Kantians, philosophy has defined the movement of thought as a certain type of passage from the hypothetical to the apodictic. Even the Cartesian movement from doubt to certainty is a variant of the passage. Another is the passage from hypothetical necessity to metaphysical necessity on the ultimate origination of things. Already with Plato the dialectic was defined in this manner: depart from hypotheses, use hypotheses as springboards or problems in order to attain the hypothetical principle which determines the solution to the problems as well as the truth of the hypotheses. The whole structure of the Parmenids follows from this, under conditions such that it is no longer possible to see therein a propaedeutics, a gymnastics, a game, or a formal exercise, as has nevertheless been done ever so delicately. Kant himself is more Platonic than he thinks when he passes from the critique of pure reason, entirely subordinated to the hypothetical form of possible experience, to the critique of practical reason in which, with the aid of problems, he discovers the pure necessity of a categorical principle. Even more so the post-Kantians when they wish to transform hypothetical ideas and the synthesis of difference 197 judgment into thetic judgment immediately, without changing critiques. 15 It is not illegitimate, therefore, to summarize in this way the movement of philosophy from Plato to Fichte or Hegel by way of Descartes, whatever the diversity of the initial hypotheses or the final apodicticities. There is at least something in common, namely, the point of departure found in a hypothesis or proposition of consciousness affected by a coefficient of uncertainty, as with Cartesian doubt, and the point of arrival found in an eminently moral apodicticity or imperative, Plato's one good, the non-deceiving God of the Cartesian cogito, Leibniz's principle of the best of all possible worlds, Kant's categorical imperative, Fichte's self, Hegel's science. However, while this procedure maximally approximates the real movement of thought, it also maximally betrays and distorts this movement, this conjointment hypotheticism and moralism, this Scientalistic hypotheticism and this rationalist moralism, render unrecognizable what they approximate. Suppose we say instead that the movement goes not from the hypothetical to the apodictic but from the problematical to the question. At first the difference seems very slight, all the slighter to the extent that while the apodictic is inseparable from a moral imperative, the question, for its part, is also inseparable from an imperative, albeit of another kind. A chasm nevertheless separates these two formulae. The assimilation of the problem and the hypothesis is already a betrayal of the problem or idea, involving the illegitimate reduction of the latter to propositions of consciousness and to representations of knowledge. The problematical is different in kind from the hypothetical, the thematic is not to be confused with the thetic. At issue in this difference is the whole distribution, the whole determination, destination and exercise of the faculties within a general doctrine. Moreover, to speak of the apodictic instance and the question instance is to speak of very different things, since these involve two kinds of imperative, incomparable in every respect. Questions are imperatives, or rather, questions express the relation between problems and the imperatives from which they proceed. Is it necessary to take the example of the police in order to demonstrate the imperative character of questions? I'm asking the questions. In fact, however, it is already the dissolved self of the one being questioned which speaks through his torturer. Problems or ideas emanate from imperatives of adventure or from events which appear in the form of questions. This is why problems are inseparable from a power of decision, a fiat which, when we are infused by it, makes us semi-divine beings. Did not mathematicians declare themselves to be descended from the gods? This power of decision is exercised to the highest degree in the two fundamental procedures of adjunction and condensation. It is grounded in the nature of the problems to be resolved, since it is always in relation to an ideal field added by the mathematician that an equation turns out to be reducible or not. The infinite power to add 198 difference and repetition an arbitrary quantity, it is no longer a question of a game after the manner of Leibniz, where the moral imperative of predetermined rules combines with the condition of a given space which must be filled ex hypothesi. It is rather a question of a throw of the dice, of the whole sky as open space and of throwing as the only rule. The singular points are on the die, the questions are the dice themselves, the imperative is to throw. Ideas are the problematic combinations which result from throws. The throw of the dice is in no way suggested as an abolition of chance, the sky chance. To abolish chance is to fragment it according to the laws of probability over several throws, in such a way that the problem is already dismembered into hypotheses of win and loss, while the imperative is moralized into the principle of choosing the best hypothesis which determines a win. By contrast, the throw of the dice affirms chance every time, each throw of the dice affirms the whole of chance each time. The repetition of throws is not subject to the persistence of the same hypothesis, nor to the identity of a constant rule. The most difficult thing is to make chance an object of affirmation, but it is the sense of the imperative and the questions that it launches. Ideas emanate from it just as singularities emanate from that aleatory point which every time condenses the whole of chance into one time. It will be said that by assigning the imperative origin of ideas to this point we invoke only the arbitrary, the simple arbitrariness of a child's game, the child God. This, however, would be to misunderstand what it means to affirm. Chance is arbitrary only in so far as it is not affirmed or not sufficiently affirmed, in so far as it is distributed within a space, a number, and under rules destined to avert it. When chance is sufficiently affirmed the player can no longer lose, since every combination and every throw which produces it is by nature adequate to the place and the mobile command of the aleatory point. What does it mean, therefore, to affirm the whole of chance, every time, in a single time? This affirmation takes place to the degree that the disparates which emanate from a throw begin to resonate, thereby forming a problem. The whole of chance is then indeed in each throw, even though this be partial, and it is there in a single time even though the combination produced is the object of a progressive determination. The throw of the dice carries out the calculation of problems, the determination of differential elements or the distribution of singular points which constitute a structure. The circular relation between imperatives and the problems which follow from them is formed in this manner. Resonance constitutes the truth of a problem as such, in which the imperative is tested, even though the problem itself is born of the imperative. Once chance is affirmed, all arbitrariness is abolished every time. Once chance is affirmed, divergence itself is the object of affirmation within a problem. The ideal fields of adjunction which determine a problem remain in the grip of the arbitrary so long as the basic field does not resonate by incorporating all the values expressible by the adjunct. In Ideas and the Synthesis of Difference 199 general a work is always in itself an ideal field of adjunction. The work is a problem born of the imperative, it is all the more perfect and total in a single throw as the problem is all the more progressively determined as a problem. The author of the work is therefore justly called the operator of the idea. When Raymond Roussel poses his equations of facts as problems to be solved, as ideal facts or events which begin to resonate as an effect of an imperative of language, or as facts which are themselves fiats, When many modern novelists install themselves in this aleatory point, this imperative and questioning blind spot from which the work develops like a problem by making divergent series resonate, they are not doing applied mathematics, or employing a mathematical or physical metaphor. Rather, by establishing that science or universal mathesis immediately in each domain, they make the work a process of learning or experimentation, but also something total every time, where the whole of chance is affirmed in each case, renewable every time, perhaps wit, HBB 16 out any subsistent AR itrinus. This power of decision at the heart of problems, this creation or throw which makes us descendant from the gods, is nevertheless not our own. The gods themselves are subject to the Anank or sky chance. The imperatives and questions with which we are infused do not emanate from the I, it is not even there to hear them. The imperatives are those of being, while every question is ontological and distributes that which is among problems. Ontology is the dice throw, the chaosmos from which the cosmos emerges. If the imperatives of being have a relation with the I, it is with the fractured I in which, every time, they displace and reconstitute the fracture according to the order of time. Imperatives do indeed form the cogitanda of pure thought, the differentials of thought, at once that which cannot be thought and that which must be thought and can be thought only from the point of view of the transcendent exercise. Questions are these pure thoughts of the cogitanda. Imperatives in the form of questions thus signify our greatest powerlessness, but also that point of which Maurice Blanquat speaks endlessly, that blind, acephalic, aphasic, and aleatory original point which designates the impossibility of thinking that is thought, that point at which powerlessness is transmuted into power, that point which develops in the work in the form of a problem. Far from referring back to the cogito as a proposition of consciousness, imperatives are addressed to the fractured I as though to the unconscious of thought. For the I has the rights of an unconscious without which it would not think, and in particular would not think the pure cogitanda. Contrary to what is stated by the banal propositions of consciousness, thought thinks only on the basis of an unconscious, and thinks that unconscious in the transcendent exercise. Consequently, far from being the properties or attributes of a thinking substance, the ideas which derive from imperatives enter and leave only by that fracture in the I, which means that another 200 difference and repetition always thinks in me, another who must also be thought. Theft is primary in thought. Of course powerlessness can remain powerlessness, but it alone can also be raised to the highest power. This is precisely what Nietzsche meant by will to power, that imperative transmutation which takes powerlessness itself as an object, be cowardly, lazy, or obedient if you wish, on condition that dice throw capable of affirming the whole of chance, those questions with which we are infused during torrid or glacial hours, those imperatives which dedicate us to the problems they launch. For there is something irreducible in the depths of the spirit, a monolithic block of fatum, of decision already taken on all problems in their measure and their relation to us, and also a right that we have to accede to certain problems, like a hot iron brand imprinted on our names. 17 How disappointing this answer seems to be. We asked what was the origin of ideas and where problems come from. In reply we invoke throws of the dice, imperatives, and questions of chance instead of an apodictic principle, an aleatory point at which everything becomes ungrounded instead of a solid ground. We contrast this chance with arbitrariness to the extent that it is affirmed, imperatively affirmed in the particular manner of the question, but we measure this affirmation itself by the resonance established between the problematic elements which result from a throw of the dice. In what circle do we turn such that we cannot speak of the origin in any other way? We distinguished 4 instances: imperative or ontological questions, dialectical problems or the themes which emerge from them, symbolic fields of solvability in which these problems are scientifically expressed in accordance with their conditions, the solutions given in these fields when the problems are incarnated in the actuality of cases. From the outset, however, what are these fiery imperatives, these questions which are the beginning of the world? The fact is that everything has its beginning in a question, but one cannot say that the question itself begins. Might the question, along with the imperative which it expresses, have no other origin than repetition? Great authors of our time, Heidegger, Blanchot, have exploited this most profound relation between the question and repetition. Not that it is sufficient, however, to repeat a single question which would remain intact at the end, even if this question is what is being. Chu en est il de l'être. It is the bad throws of the dice which are inscribed in the same hypotheses, representing propositions of consciousness or the opinions of a common sense, and approach what is more or less the same apodictic principle, representing the determination of the winning throw. It is the bad players who repeat only by fragmenting chance and dividing it among several throws. By contrast, the good throw of the dice affirms all of chance in one throw, and it is here that we find the essence of what is called a question. There are nevertheless several throws of the dice, the throw of the dice is repeated. Each, however, takes the chance all at once, and instead of having the different ideas and the synthesis of difference 201 combinations, result from the same, has the same, or the repetition, result from the different. In this sense, the repetition which is consubstantial with the question is at the source of the perplication of ideas. The differential of the idea is itself inseparable from the process of repetition which define the throw of the dice. There is an iteration in calculus just as there is a repetition in problems which reproduces that of the questions or the imperatives from which it proceeds. Here again, however, it is not an ordinary repetition. Ordinary repetition is prolongation, continuation, or that length of time which is stretched into duration. Bare repetition, it can be discontinued, but remains fundamentally the repetition of the same. However, who is prolonged in this manner? A singularity, as far as the vicinity of another singularity. On the contrary, what defines the extraordinary power of that clothed repetition more profound than bare repetition is the reprise of singularities by one another, the condensation of singularities one into another, as much in the same problem or idea as between one problem and another or from one idea to another. Repetition is this emission of singularities, always with an echo or resonance which makes each the double of the other, or each constellation the redistribution of another. Moreover, it amounts to the same thing to say that clothed repetition is more profound at the level of problems, and that repetition results from the different at the level of the questions from which these proceed. Heidegger shows clearly how the repetition of the question itself develops in the relation between the problem and repetition. By a repetition of a fundamental problem we understand the disclosure of the primordial possibilities concealed in it. The development of these possibilities has the effect of transforming the problem and thus preserving it in its import as a problem. To preserve a problem means to free and to safeguard its intrinsic powers, which are the source of its essence and which make it possible as a problem. The repetition of the possibilities of a problem, therefore, is not a simple taking up of that which is in vogue with regard to this problem. The possible, thus understood, in fact hinders all genuine repetition and thereby all relation to history. A good interpretation must, on the contrary, decide how far the understanding of the possible which governs all repetition extends and whether it is equal to that which is repeatable. 18. What is this possible at the heart of a problem which stands opposed to the possibilities or propositions of consciousness, to the currently accepted opinions which make up hypotheses? Nothing but the potentiality of an idea, its determinable virtuality. On this point, Heidegger is Nietzschean. Of what is repetition said in the eternal return if not the will to power, the world of the will to power with its imperatives, its throws of the dice and its problems resulting from such throws? Repetition in the eternal return 202 difference and repetition never means continuation, perpetuation, or prolongation, nor even the discontinuous return of something which would at least be able to be prolonged in a partial cycle, an identity, an I, a self, but, on the contrary, the reprise of pre-individual singularities which, in order that it can be grasped as repetition, presupposes the dissolution of all prior identities. Every origin is a singularity and every singularity a commencement on the horizontal line, the line of ordinary points on which it is prolonged like so many reproductions or copies which form the moments of a bare repetition. It is also, however, a recommencement on the vertical line which condenses singularities and on which is woven the other repetition, the line of the affirmation of chance. If being is above all difference and commencement, being is itself repetition, the recommencement of being. Repetition is the provided of the condition which authenticates the imperatives of being. This is the constant ambiguity of the notion of origin and the reason for our earlier deception. Origins are assigned only in a world which challenges the original as much as the copy, and an origin assigns a ground only in a world already precipitated into universal ungrounding. One final consequence remains, concerning the status of negation. There is a non-being, yet there is neither negative nor negation. There is a non-being which is by no means the being of the negative, but rather the being of the problematic. The symbol for this, non-being or being is 0/0. The 0 here refers only to difference and its repetition. This, non-being which corresponds to the form of a problematic field, even though the modalities of proposition tend to assimilate it to negative non-being, reappears with the so-called expletive any which grammarians have so much difficulty in interpreting. Like the witness of an extra-propositional grammatical instance, an expletive any always appears in propositions where there is a question developed into a problem. The negative is an illusion, no more than a shadow of problems. We have seen how problems were necessarily hidden by possible propositions corresponding to cases of solution. Instead of being grasped as problems, they can then appear as no more than hypotheses or series of hypotheses. As a proposition of consciousness, each of these hypotheses is flanked by a double negative, whether the one is, whether the one is not, whether it is fine, whether it is not fine. The negative is an illusion because the form of negation appears with propositions which express the problem on which they depend only by distorting it and obscuring its real structure. Once the problem is translated into hypotheses, each hypothetical affirmation is doubled by a negation, which amounts to the state of a problem betrayed by its shadow. There is no idea of the negative any more than there are hypotheses in nature, even though nature does proceed by means of problems. That is why it matters little whether the negative is understood as logical limitation or real opposition. Consider the great negative notions such as the many in relation to the one, disorder in relation to order, ideas and the synthesis of difference 203 nothingness in relation to being. It makes no difference whether they are interpreted as the limit of a process of degeneration or as the antithesis of a thesis. At best, the process will be grounded, either in the analytic substance of God or in the synthetic form of the self. God or the self, it is the same thing. In both cases we remain in the hypothetical element of a simple concept, under which are subsumed either all the infinite degrees of an identical representation or the infinite opposition of two contrary representations. Critiques of the negative are never decisive as long as they invoke the rights of a first concept, the one, order, being. They are no more so as long as they are content to translate opposition into limitation. The critique of the negative is effective only when it denounces the interchangeability of opposition and limitation, thereby denouncing the hypothetical conceptual element which necessarily sustains one or the other, or even one by means of the other. In short, the critique of the negative must be conducted on the basis of the ideal, differential and problematic element, on the basis of the idea. It is the notion of multiplicity which denounces simultaneously the one and the many, the limitation of the one by the many and the opposition of the many to the one. It is variety which denounces simultaneously order and disorder, and non-being or being which denounces simultaneously both being and non-being. The complicity of the negative and the hypothetical must everywhere be dissolved in favor of a more profound link between difference and the problematic. In effect, the idea is made up of reciprocal relations between differential elements, completely determined by those relations which never include any negative term or relation of negativity. The oppositions, conflicts, and contradictions in the concept appear such crude and rough measures by contrast with the fine and differential mechanisms which characterize the idea, weight in contrast to lightness. We should reserve the name positivity for this state of the multiple idea or this consistency of the problematic. Moreover, we must guard every time against the manner in which this perfectly positive, non-being leans towards a negative non-being and tends to collapse into its own shadow, finding there its most profound distortion, to the further advantage of the illusion of consciousness. Take the example of the linguistic idea, so frequently invoked today. As defined by phonology, the linguistic idea certainly has all the characteristics of a structure, the presence of differential elements, called phonemes, extracted from the continuous sonorous flux, the existence of differential relations, distinctive features, which reciprocally and completely determine these elements, the value of singular points assumed by the phonemes in that determination, pertinent particularities, the manner in which the system of language so constituted assumes the character of a multiplicity, the problematic nature of which objectively represents the set of problems which the language poses for itself, and 204 difference and repetition solves in the constitution of significations, the unconscious, non-actual, and virtual character of the elements and relations, along with their double status of transcendence and immanence with regard to the sounds actually articulated, the double actualization of the differential elements. The double incarnation of the differential relations at once both in different languages and in the different significant parts of the same language, differentiation, each language incarnating certain varieties of relation and certain singular points, the complementarity of sense and structure, genesis and structure, where this takes the form of a passive genesis which is revealed in this actualization. Now, despite all these aspects which define a fully positive multiplicity, linguists constantly speak in negative terms and assimilate the differential relations between phonemes to relations of opposition. Perhaps it might be said that this is only a matter of conventional terminology, and that opposition here means simply correlation. It is true that the notion of opposition employed by linguists seems particularly pluralist and relativized, since each phoneme enters into several distinct oppositions with other phonemes from different points of view. For example, in Trubetskoy's classification, opposition is so dismembered and distributed among the coexisting varieties of relation that it no longer exists as opposition but rather as a complex or perplexed differential mechanism. A Hegelian would not be at home there, in the absence of the uniformity of a large contradiction. Nevertheless, we touch here upon an essential point, here as elsewhere, in phonology as well as in other domains and with regard to other ideas. It is a question of knowing whether it is enough to pluralize opposition or to overdetermine contradiction and to distribute them among different figures which, despite everything, still preserve the form of the negative. It seems to us that pluralism is a more enticing and dangerous thought. Fragmentation implies overturning. The discovery in any domain of a plurality of coexisting oppositions is inseparable from a more profound discovery, that of difference, which denounces the negative and opposition itself as no more than appearances in relation to the problematic field of a positive multiplicity. 191 cannot pluralize opposition without leaving its domain and entering the caves of difference which resonate with a pure positivity and reject opposition as no more than a shadow cavern seen from without. To return to the linguistic idea, why does Saussure, at the very moment when he discovers that in language there are only differences, add that these differences are without positive terms and eternally negative? Why does Trubetskoy maintain as sacred the principle that the idea of difference which is constitutive of language presupposes the idea of opposition? Everything points to the contrary. Is this not a way of introducing the point of view of consciousness and actual representations into what should be the transcendent exploration of the idea of the linguistic unconscious, in other words, the highest exercise of speech in ideas and the synthesis of difference? 205 Relation to the point zero of language? When we interpret differences under the category of opposition and as negatives, are we not already on the side of the listener, even that of the bad listener who hesitates between several possible versions of what was actually said and tries to find himself by establishing oppositions? In other words, are we not on the lesser side of language rather than the side of the one who speaks and assigns meaning? Have we not already betrayed the nature of the play of language, in other words, the sense of that comminatory, of those imperatives or linguistic throws of the dice which, like Artaud's cries, can be understood only by the one who speaks in the transcendent exercise of language? In short, the translation of difference into opposition seems to us to concern not a simple question of terminology or convention, but rather the essence of language and the linguistic idea. When difference is read as opposition, it is deprived of the peculiar thickness in which its positivity is affirmed. Modern phonology lacks a dimension which would prevent it from playing with shadows on a single plane. In a sense, this is Gustave Guillaume's message throughout his work, the importance of which is today beginning to be understood. For opposition teaches us nothing about the nature of that which is thought to be opposed. The selection of phonemes possessing pertinent value in this or that language is inseparable from that of morphemes as elements of grammatical constructions. Moreover, the morphemes, which on their own account bring into play the virtual whole of the language, are the object of a progressive determination which proceeds by differential thresholds and implies a purely logical time capable of measuring the genesis or actualization. The formal reciprocal determination of the phonemes refers to that progressive determination which expresses the action of the virtual system on the phonic matter, and it is only when the phonemes are considered abstractly, in other words, when the virtual is reduced to a simple possible, that their relations take the negative form of an empty opposition, rather than that of filling differential positions around a threshold. The fundamental lesson of Guillaume's work is the substitution of a principle of differential position for that of distinctive opposition. Point 20. The substitution takes place to the extent that morphology is no longer simply a continuation of phonology, but rather introduces properly problematic values which determine the significant selection of phonemes. For us, it is from this linguistic point of view that non-being finds the confirmation of its necessary dissociation, on the one hand, in any that we have called discordant, disparate, or differential rather than negative, a problematic any which should be written as non-being or being, on the other hand, in a so-called foreclusive pa which should be written as non-being, but which indicates in the engendered proposition only the result of the preceding process. In fact, it is not the expletive any which presents a little understood special case of negation, rather, the expletive any is the 206 difference and repetition original sense from which emerges the negation pa, both as a necessary consequence and as an inevitable illusion. Any pa divides into a problematic any and a negative pa which are like two instances differing in kind, the second of which attracts the first only in order to betray it. The genesis of the negative is as follows: the affirmations of being are genetic elements in the form of imperative questions, these develop in the positivity of problems, the propositions of consciousness are engendered affirmations which designate cases of solution. Each proposition, however, has a double negative which expresses the shadow of the problem in the domain of solutions, in other words, it expresses the manner in which the problem subsists in the distorted image of it given in representation. The formula that is not the case means that a hypothesis passes over into the negative insofar as it does not represent the currently fulfilled conditions of a problem, to which, on the contrary, another proposition corresponds. The negative is indeed, therefore, the turning shadow of the problematic upon the set of propositions that it subsumes as cases. As a general rule, the critique of the negative remains ineffective so long as it assumes as given the form of affirmation ready-made in the proposition. The critique of the negative is radical and well-grounded only when it carries out a genesis of affirmation and, simultaneously, the genesis of the appearance of negation. For the question is to know how affirmation itself can be multiple, or how difference as such can be the object of pure affirmation. This is possible only to the extent that affirmation as a mode of the proposition is produced from extra-propositional genetic elements, the imperative questions or original ontological affirmations, then carried through or determined by way of problems, multiplicities or problematic ideas, ideal positivities. Under these conditions, it must be said in effect that the negative in the proposition sits alongside affirmation, but only as the shadow of the problem to which the proposition is thought to respond, in other words, like the shadow of the genetic instance which produces the affirmation itself. Ideas contain all the varieties of differential relations and all the distributions of singular points coexisting in diverse orders perplicated in one another. When the virtual content of an idea is actualized, the varieties of relation are incarnated in distinct species while the singular points which correspond to the values of one variety are incarnated in the distinct parts characteristic of this or that species. The idea of color, for example, is like white light which replicates in itself the genetic elements and relations of all the colors, but is actualized in the diverse colors with their respective spaces, or the idea of sound, which is also like white noise. There is even a white society and a white language, the latter being that which contains in its virtuality all the phonemes and relations destined to be actualized in diverse languages and in the distinctive parts of a given language. Thus, with actualization, a new type of specific and partitive distinction takes the ideas and the synthesis of difference 207 place of the fluent ideal distinctions. We call the determination of the virtual content of an idea differentiation, we call the actualization of that virtuality into species and distinguished parts differentiation. It is always in relation to a differentiated problem or to the differentiated conditions of a problem that a differentiation of species and parts is carried out, as though it corresponded to the cases of solution of the problem. It is always a problematic field which conditions a differentiation within the milieu in which it is incarnated. Consequently, and this is all we wish to say, the negative appears neither in the process of differentiation nor in the process of differentiation. The idea knows nothing of negation. The first process is identical with the description of a pure positivity, in the form of a problem to which are assigned relations and points, places and functions, positions and differential thresholds which exclude all negative determination and find their source in the genetic or productive elements of affirmation. The other process is identical with the production of finite engendered affirmations which bear upon the actual terms which occupy these places and positions, and upon the real relations which incarnate these relations and these functions. Forms of the negative do indeed appear in actual terms and real relations, but only in so far as these are cut off from the virtuality which they actualize, and from the movement of their actualization. Then, and only then, do the finite affirmations appear limited in themselves, opposed to one another, and suffering from lack or privation. In short, the negative is always derived and represented, never original or present. The process of difference and of differentiation is primary in relation to that of the negative and opposition. Those commentators on Marx who insist upon the fundamental difference between Marx and Hegel rightly point out that in capital the category of differentiation, the differentiation at the heart of a social multiplicity, the division of labor, is substituted for the Hegelian concepts of opposition, contradiction, and alienation, the latter forming only an apparent movement and standing only for abstract effects separated from the principle and from the real movement of their production. Point 21 clearly. At this point the philosophy of difference must be wary of turning into the discourse of beautiful souls, differences, nothing but differences, in a peaceful coexistence in the idea of social places and functions, but the name of Marx is sufficient to save it from this danger. The problems of a society, as they are determined in the infrastructure in the form of so-called abstract labor, receive their solution from the process of actualization or differentiation, the concrete division of labor. However, as long as the problem throws its shadow over the ensemble of differentiated cases forming the solution, these will present a falsified image of the problem itself. It cannot even be said that the falsification comes afterwards, it accompanies or doubles the actualization. A problem is always reflected in false problems while it is being solved, so that the 208 difference and repetition solution is generally perverted by an inseparable falsity. For example, according to Marx, fetishism is indeed an absurdity, an illusion of social consciousness, so long as we understand by this not a subjective illusion born of individual consciousness but an objective or transcendental illusion born out of the conditions of social consciousness in the course of its actualization. There are those for whom the whole of differentiated social existence is tied to the false problems which enable them to live, and others for whom social existence is entirely contained in the false problems of which they occupy the fraudulent positions, and from which they suffer. All the figures of nonsense appear in the objective field of the false problem, that is, all the counterfeit forms of affirmation, distortions of elements and relations, and confusions of the distinctive with the ordinary. This is why history is no less the locus of nonsense and stupidity than it is the process of sense or meaning. While it is the nature of consciousness to be false, problems by their nature escape consciousness. The natural object of social consciousness or common sense with regard to the recognition of value is the fetish. Social problems can be grasped only by means of a rectification which occurs when the faculty of sociability is raised to its transcendent exercise and breaks the unity of fetishistic common sense. The transcendent object of the faculty of sociability is revolution. In this sense, revolution is the social power of difference, the paradox of society, the particular wrath of the social idea. Revolution never proceeds by way of the negative. We could not have established the first determination of the negative, as shadow of the problem as such, without already being embarked upon a second determination. The negative is the objective field of the false problem, the fetish in person. The negative is both shadow of the problem and false problem par excellence. Practical struggle never proceeds by way of the negative but by way of difference and its power of affirmation, and the war of the righteous is for the conquest of the highest power, that of deciding problems by restoring them to their truth, by evaluating that truth beyond the representations of consciousness and the forms of the negative, and by acceding at last to the imperatives on which they depend. We have ceaselessly invoked the virtual. In so doing, have we not fallen into the vagueness of a notion closer to the undetermined than to the determinations of difference? It is precisely this, however, that we wish to avoid in speaking of the virtual. We opposed the virtual and the real, although it could not have been more precise before now. This terminology must be corrected. The virtual is opposed not to the real but to the actual. The virtual is fully real in so far as it is virtual. Exactly what Proust said of states of resonance must be said of the virtual, real without being actual, ideal without being abstract, and symbolic without being fictional. Indeed, Ideas and the Synthesis of Difference 209. The virtual must be defined as strictly a part of the real object, as though the object had one part of itself in the virtual into which it plunged as though into an objective dimension. Accounts of the differential calculus often liken the differential to a portion of the difference. Or, following Lagrange's method, the question is asked which part of the mathematical object presents the relations in question and must be considered derived. The reality of the virtual consists of the differential elements and relations along with the singular points which correspond to them. The reality of the virtual is structure. We must avoid giving the elements and relations which form a structure an actuality which they do not have, and withdrawing from them a reality which they have. We have seen that a double process of reciprocal determination and complete determination define that reality. Far from being undetermined, the virtual is completely determined. When it is claimed that works of art are immersed in a virtuality, what is being invoked is not some confused determination but the completely determined structure formed by its genetic differential elements, its virtual or embryonic elements. The elements, varieties of relations and singular points coexist in the work or the object, in the virtual part of the work or object, without it being possible to designate a point of view privileged over others, a center which would unify the other centers. How, then, can we speak simultaneously of both complete determination and only a part of the object? The determination must be a complete determination of the object, yet form only a part of it. Following suggestions made by Descartes in his replies to Arnaud, we must carefully distinguish the object in so far as it is complete and the object in so far as it is whole. What is complete is only the ideal part of the object, which participates with other parts of objects in the idea, other relations, other singular points, but never constitutes an integral whole as such. What the complete determination lacks is the whole set of relations belonging to actual existence. An object may be ens, or rather, non, ens omni modo determinatum, without being entirely determined or actually existing. There is thus another part of the object which is determined by actualization. Mathematicians ask, what is this other part represented by the so-called primitive function? In this sense, integration is by no means the inverse of differentiation but, rather, forms an original process of differentiation. Whereas differentiation determines the virtual content of the idea as problem, differentiation expresses the actualization of this virtual and the constitution of solutions, by local integrations. Differentiation is like the second part of difference, and in order to designate the integrity or the integrality of the object we require the complex notion of difference/ciation. The T and the C here are the distinctive feature or the phonological relation of difference in person. Every object is double without it being the case that the two halves resemble one another, one being a virtual image and the other an actual image. They are unequal 210 difference and repetition odd halves. Differentiation itself already has two aspects of its own, corresponding to the varieties of relations and to the singular points dependent upon the values of each variety. However, differentiation in turn has two aspects, one concerning the qualities or diverse species which actualize the varieties, the other concerning number or the distinct parts actualizing the singular points. For example, genes as a system of differential relations are incarnated at once both in a species and in the organic parts of which it is composed. There is in general no quality which does not refer to a space defined by the singularities corresponding to the differential relations incarnated in that quality. The work of Lavelle and of Nogue, for example, has shown the existence of spaces belonging to qualities and the manner in which these spaces are constructed alongside singularities, so that a difference in quality is always subtended by a spatial difference, diaphora. Furthermore, the reflections of painters teach us everything about the space of each color and the alignment of such spaces within a work. Species are differentiated only insofar as each has parts which are themselves differentiated. Differentiation is always simultaneously differentiation of species and parts, of qualities and extensities, determination of qualities or determination of species, but also partition or organization. How, then, do these two aspects of differentiation connect with the two preceding aspects of differentiation? How do the two dissimilar halves of an object fit together? Qualities and species incarnate the varieties of actual relation, organic parts incarnate the corresponding singularities. However, the precision with which they fit together is better seen from two complementary points of view. On the one hand, complete determination carries out the differentiation of singularities, but it bears only upon their existence and their distribution. The nature of these singular points is specified only by the form of the neighboring integral curves, in other words, by virtue of the actual or differentiated species and spaces. On the other hand, the essential aspects of sufficient reason, determinability, reciprocal determination, complete determination, find their systematic unity in progressive determination. In effect, the reciprocity of determination does not signify a regression, nor a marking time, but a veritable progression in which the reciprocal terms must be secured step by step, and the relations themselves established between them. The completeness of the determination also implies the progressivity of adjunct fields. In going from A to B and then B to A, we do not arrive back at the point of departure as in a bare repetition, rather, the repetition between A and band B and A is the progressive tour or description of the whole of a problematic field. It is like Vitrac's poem, where the different steps which each form a poem, writing, dreaming, forgetting, looking for the opposite, homoourising, and finally rediscovering by analyzing, progressively determine the whole poem as a problem or a multiplicity. In this sense, by virtue of this progressivity, every ideas and the synthesis of difference 211 structure has a purely logical, ideal or dialectical time. However, this virtual time itself determines a time of differentiation, or rather rhythms or different times of actualization which correspond to the relations and singularities of the structure and, for their part, measure the passage from virtual to actual. In this regard, four terms are synonymous: actualize, differentiate, integrate and solve. For the nature of the virtual is such that, for it, to be actualized is to be differentiated. Each differentiation is a local integration or a local solution which then connects with others in the overall solution or the global integration. This is how, in the case of the organic, the process of actualization appears simultaneously as the local differentiation of parts, the global formation of an internal milieu, and the solution of a problem posed within the field of constitution of an organism. Point 22. An organism is nothing if not the solution to a problem, as are each of its differentiated organs, such as the eye which solves a light problem, but nothing within the organism, no organ, would be differentiated without the internal milieu endowed with a general effectivity or integrating power of regulation. Here again, in the case of living matter, the negative forms of opposition and contradiction, obstacle and need, are secondary and derivative in relation to the imperatives of an organism to be constructed or a problem to be solved. The only danger in all this is that the virtual could be confused with the possible. The possible is opposed to the real, the process undergone by the possible is therefore a realization. By contrast, the virtual is not opposed to the real, it possesses a full reality by itself. The process it undergoes is that of actualization. It would be wrong to see only a verbal dispute here, it is a question of existence itself. Every time we pose the question in terms of possible and real, we are forced to conceive of existence as a brute eruption, a pure act or leap which always occurs behind our backs and is subject to a law of all or nothing. What difference can there be between the existent and the non-existent if the non-existent is already possible, already included in the concept and having all the characteristics that the concept confers upon it as a possibility? Existence is the same as but outside the concept. Existence is therefore supposed to occur in space and time, but these are understood as indifferent milieu instead of the production of existence occurring in a characteristic space and time. Difference can no longer be anything but the negative determined by the concept, either the limitation imposed by possibles upon each other in order to be realized, or the opposition of the possible to the reality of the real. The virtual, by contrast, is the characteristic state of ideas, it is on the basis of its reality that existence is produced, in accordance with the time and a space immanent in the idea. Secondly, the possible and the virtual are further distinguished by the fact that one refers to the form of identity in the concept, whereas the other designates a pure multiplicity in the idea which radically excludes the 212 difference and repetition identical as a prior condition. Finally, to the extent that the possible is open to realization, it is understood as an image of the real, while the real is supposed to resemble the possible. That is why it is difficult to understand what existence adds to the concept when all it does is double like with like. Such is the defect of the possible, a defect which serves to condemn it as produced after the fact, as retroactively fabricated in the image of what resembles it. The actualization of the virtual, on the contrary, always takes place by difference, divergence, or differentiation. Actualization breaks with resemblance as a process no less than it does with identity as a principle. Actual terms never resemble the singularities they incarnate. In this sense, actualization, or differentiation is always a genuine creation. It does not result from any limitation of a pre-existing possibility. It is contradictory to speak of potential, as certain biologists do, and to define differentiation by the simple limitation of a global power, as though this potential were indistinguishable from a logical possibility. For a potential or virtual object, to be actualized is to create divergent lines which correspond to, without resembling, a virtual multiplicity. The virtual possesses the reality of a task to be performed or a problem to be solved, it is the problem which orientates, conditions and engenders solutions, but these do not resemble the conditions of the problem. Bergson was right, therefore, to say that from the point of view of differentiation, even the resemblances which appear along divergent lines of evolution, for example, the eye as an analogous organ, must be related first of all to the heterogeneity in the production mechanism. Moreover, the subordination of difference to identity and that of difference to similitude must be overturned in the same movement. What is this correspondence, however, without resemblance or creative differentiation? The Bergsonian schema which unites creative evolution and matter and memory begins with the account of a gigantic memory, a multiplicity formed by the virtual coexistence of all the sections of the cone, each section being the repetition of all the others and being distinguished from them only by the order of the relations and the distribution of singular points. Then, the actualization of this mnemonic virtual appears to take the form of the creation of divergent lines, each of which corresponds to a virtual section and represents a manner of solving a problem, but also the incarnation of the order of relations and distribution of similarities peculiar to the given section in differentiated species and parts. Point 2 Difference and repetition in the virtual ground the movement of actualization, of differentiation as creation. They are thereby substituted for the identity and the resemblance of the possible, which inspires only a pseudo-movement, the false movement of realization understood as abstract limitation. Any hesitation between the virtual and the possible, the order of the idea and the order of the concept, is disastrous, since it abolishes the reality of the virtual. There are traces of such an oscillation in the philosophy of ideas and the synthesis of difference. 213 Leibniz. Every time Leibniz speaks of ideas, he presents them as virtual multiplicities made of differential relations and singular points, which thought apprehends in a state close to sleep, stupor, swooning, death, amnesia, murmuring or intoxication. 24 However, that in which ideas are actualized is rather conceived as a possible, a realized possible. This hesitation between the possible and the virtual explains why no one has gone further than Leibniz in the exploration of sufficient reason, and why, nevertheless, no one has better maintained the illusion of a subordination of that sufficient reason to the identical. No one has come closer to a movement of vice-diction in the idea, but no one has better maintained the supposed right of representation, albeit at the price of rendering it infinite. No one has been better able to immerse thought in the element of difference and provide it with a differential unconscious, surrounded with little glimmerings and singularities, all in order to save and reconstitute the homogeneity of a natural light à la Descartes. It is in effect with Descartes that the principle of representation as good sense or common sense appears in its highest form. We can call this the principle of the clear and distinct, or the principle of the proportionality of the clear and the distinct. An idea is all the more distinct the clearer it is, and clarity-distinctness constitutes the light which renders thought possible in the common exercise of all the faculties. Given this principle, we cannot overemphasize the importance of a remark that Leibniz constantly makes in his Logic of Ideas: a clear idea is in itself confused, it is confused in so far as it is clear. Without doubt, this remark may be accommodated within the Cartesian logic, and taken to mean simply that a clear idea is confused because it is not yet clear enough in all its parts. Moreover, is this not how Leibniz himself finally tends to interpret it? However, is it not also susceptible to another more radical interpretation, according to which there would be a difference between the clear and the distinct, not just of degree but in kind, such that the clear would be in itself confused and the distinct in itself obscure? What is this distinct obscure which corresponds to the clear confused? Consider Leibniz's famous passages on the murmuring of the sea. Here too, two interpretations are possible. Either we say that the apperception of the whole noise is clear but confused, not distinct, because the component little perceptions are themselves not clear but obscure, or we say that the little perceptions are themselves distinct and obscure, not clear distinct because they grasp differential relations and singularities, obscure because they are not yet distinguished, not yet differentiated. These singularities then condense to determine a threshold of consciousness in relation to our bodies, a threshold of differentiation on the basis of which the little perceptions are actualized, but actualized in an apperception which in turn is only clear and confused, clear because it is distinguished or differentiated, and confused because it is clear. The problem is then no longer posed in terms of whole parts, from the point of view of logical 214 difference and repetition possibility, but in terms of virtual actualization of differential relations, incarnation of singular points. At this point, the value of representation in the common sense divides into two irreducible values in the para sense, a distinctness which can only be obscure, the more obscure the more it is distinct, and a confusion clarity which can only be confused. The nature of the idea is to be distinct and obscure. In other words, the idea is precisely real without being actual, differentiated without being differentiated, and complete without being entire. Distinctness obscurity is intoxication, the properly philosophical stupor or the Dionysian idea. Leibniz very nearly encountered Dionysus at the seashore or near the water-mill. Perhaps Apollo, the clear confused thinker, is needed in order to think the ideas of Dionysus. However, the two never unite in order to reconstitute a natural light. Rather, they compose two languages which are encoded in the language of philosophy and directed at the divergent exercise of the faculties, the disparity of style. How does actualization occur in things themselves? Why is differentiation at once both composition and determination of qualities, organization and determination of species? Why is differentiation differentiated along these two complementary paths? Beneath the actual qualities and extensities, species, and parts, there are spatio-temporal dynamisms. These are the actualizing, differentiating agencies. They must be surveyed in every domain, even though they are ordinarily hidden by the constituted qualities and extensities. Embryology shows that the division of an egg into parts is secondary in relation to more significant morphogenetic movements, the augmentation of free surfaces, stretching of cellular layers, invagination by folding, regional displacement of groups. A whole kinematics of the egg appears, which implies a dynamic. Moreover, this dynamic expresses something ideal. Transport is Dionysian, divine, and delirious, before it is local transfer. Types of egg are therefore distinguished by the orientations, the axes of development, the differential speeds and rhythms which are the primary factors in the actualization of a structure and create a space and a time peculiar to that which is actualized. Baer concluded, on the one hand, that differentiation went from the more general to the less general because the dynamic structural characteristics of the major types or branches appeared before the merely formal characteristics of the species, the genus, or even the class, and, on the other hand, that the irreducibility of these dynamisms, the fault lines between these types, imposed actual distinctions between ideas and singular limitations upon the possibilities of evolution. However, these 2 points raise many problems. In the first place, the highest generalities put forward by Baer are generalities only for an adult observer who contemplates them from without. In themselves, they are lived by the individual embryo in its field of individuation. Furthermore, Ideas and the Synthesis of Difference 215, as Viol-Leyton, a disciple of Baer, points out, they can only be lived, and lived only by the individual embryo. There are things that only an embryo can do, movements that it alone can undertake or even withstand. For example, the anterior member of the tortoise undergoes a relative displacement of 180 degrees, while the neck involves the forward slippage of a variable number of protovertebrae. Point 25. The destiny and achievement of the embryo is to live the unlivable, to sustain forced movements of a scope which would break any skeleton or tear ligaments. It is indeed true that differentiation is progressive and serial. The characteristics of the major types appear before those of genus and species in the order of the determination of species, and in the order of organization. This shoot is the beginning of a paw before it becomes a right or left paw. Rather than a difference in generality, however, this movement implies a difference in kind. Rather than discovering the more general beneath the less general, we discover pure spatio-temporal dynamisms, the lived experience of the embryo, with regard to the constituted parts and qualities, beneath the morphological, histological, anatomical, physiological, and other characteristics. Rather than going from more to less general, determination progresses from virtual to actual in accordance with the primary factors of actualization. The notion of generality here suffers the disadvantage of suggesting a confusion between the virtual, insofar as it is actualized by a process of creation, and the possible, insofar as it is realized by limitation. Before the embryo as general support of qualities and parts there is the embryo as individual and patient subject of spatio-temporal dynamisms, the larval subject. As for the other aspect, that of the possibility of evolution, we must approach it in terms of pre-evolutionist polemics. The great controversy between Cuvier and Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire concerns the unity of composition. Is there an animal in itself or an idea of the universal animal, or do the subkingdoms introduce impassable gulfs between the types of animal? The discussion finds its poetic method and test in folding. Is it possible to pass by folding from vertebrate to cephalopod? Can a vertebrate be folded in such a manner that the two ends of the spine approach one another, the head moving towards the feet, the pelvis towards the neck, and the viscera arranged in the manner of cephalopods? Cuvier denies that folding can produce such an arrangement. What animal could pass the test, even reduced to its dry skeleton? Geoffroy, it is true, does not claim that the passage is carried out by folding. His argument is more profound, that there are developmental times which stop a given animal at a particular degree of composition. Organ A would be in an unusual relation to organ C if B were not produced, or if development had stopped too soon and prevented its production. Point 26. The introduction of the temporal factor is essential, even though Geoffroy conceives of it only in the form of stoppages, in other words, progressive stages ordered 216 difference and repetition according to the realization of a possible common to all animals. It is enough to endow time with its true meaning of creative actualization for evolution to find a principle which conditions it. For if, from the point of view of actualization, the dynamism of spatial directions determines a differentiation of types, then the more or less rapid times immanent to these dynamisms ground the passage from one to the other, from one differentiated type to another, either by deceleration or by acceleration. With contracted or extended times and according to the reasons for acceleration or delay, other spaces are created. Even the stoppage assumes the aspect of a creative actualization in the case of neoteny. In principle, the temporal factor allows the transformation of dynamisms, even though these may be asymmetrical, spatially irreducible, and completely differentiated, or rather, differentiating. In this sense, Perrier saw phenomena of accelerated repetition, tachygenesis, at the origin of the branchings of the animal kingdom, and found in the precocity of the appearance of types a superior proof of evolution itself. Point 2. The entire world is an egg. The double differentiation of species and parts always presupposes spatiotemporal dynamisms. Take a division into 24 cellular elements endowed with similar characteristics. Nothing yet tells us the dynamic process by which it was obtained. 2x12, 2x2, plus, 2x10, or, 2x4, plus, 2x8. Even Platonic division would lack a rule with which to distinguish the two sides, if movements and orientations or spatial lines did not provide one. Thus, in the case of fishing, entrap the prey or strike it from top to bottom or from bottom to top. It is the dynamic processes which determine the actualization of ideas. But what is their relation to this actualization? They are precisely dramas, they dramatize the idea. On the one hand, they create or trace a space corresponding to the differential relations and to the singularities to be actualized. When a cellular migration takes place, as Raymond Rouyer shows, it is the requirements of a role insofar as this follows from a structural theme to be actualized which determines the situation, not the other way round. Point 28. The world is an egg, but the egg itself is a theater, a staged theater in which the roles dominate the actors, the spaces dominate the roles and the ideas dominate the spaces. Furthermore, by virtue of the complexity of ideas and their relations with other ideas, the spatial dramatization is played out on several levels, in the constitution of an internal space, but also in the manner in which that space extends into the external extensity, occupying a region of it. For example, the internal space of a color is not to be confused with the manner in which it occupies an extensity where it enters into relations with other colors, whatever the affinity between these two processes. A living being is not only defined genetically, by the dynamisms which determine its internal milieu, but also ecologically, by the external movements which preside over its distribution within an extensity. A kinetics of population adjoins, without resembling, ideas and the synthesis of difference. 217. The kinetics of the egg, a geographic process of isolation may be no less formative of species than internal genetic variations, and sometimes precedes the latter. Point 29. Everything is even more complicated when we consider that the internal space is itself made up of multiple spaces which must be locally integrated and connected, and that this connection, which may be achieved in many ways, pushes the object or living being to its own limits, all in contact with the exterior, and that this relation with the exterior, and with other things and living beings, implies in turn connections and global integrations which differ in kind from the preceding. Everywhere a staging at several levels. On the other hand, the dynamisms are no less temporal than spatial. They constitute a time of actualization or differentiation no less than they outline spaces of actualization. Not only do these spaces begin to incarnate differential relations between elements of the reciprocally and completely determined structure, but the times of differentiation incarnate the time of the structure, the time of progressive determination. Such times may be called differential rhythms in view of their role in the actualization of the idea. Finally, beneath species and parts, we find only these times, these rates of growth, these paces of development, these decelerations or accelerations, these durations of gestation. It is not wrong to say that time alone provides the response to a question, and space alone provides the solution to a problem. Consider the following example, concerning sterility and fecundity. In the case of the female sea urchin and the male annelid problem, will certain paternal chromosomes be incorporated into new nuclei, or will they be dispersed into the protoplasm? Question, will they arrive soon enough? However, the distinction is obviously relative, for it is clear that the dynamism is simultaneously temporal and spatial, in other words, spatio-temporal. In this case, the formation of cones of division, the splitting of chromosomes and the movement which takes them to the poles of the cones. The duality does not exist in the process of actualization itself, but only in its outcome, in the actual terms, species, and parts. Nor is it a question of a real distinction but rather a strict complementarity, since the species designates the quality of the parts just as the parts designate the number of the species. More precisely, the species gathers the time of the dynamism into a quality, lioness, frogness, while the parts outline its space. A quality always flashes within a space and endures the whole time of that space. In short, dramatization is the differentiation of differentiation, at once both qualitative and quantitative. However, in saying at once we mean that differentiation differentiates itself into these two correlative paths, species and parts, determination of species and determination of parts. Just as there is a difference of difference which gathers up the different, so there is a differentiation of differentiation which integrates and welds together the differentiated. This is a necessary outcome to the extent that dramatization inseparably incarnates the 218 difference and repetition traits of the idea, differential relations and corresponding singular points, the latter being actualized in the parts while the former are actualized in the species. Are not these spatiotemporal determinations what Kant called schemata? There is, nevertheless, an important difference. A schema is indeed a rule of determination for time and of construction for space, but it is conceived and put to work in relation to concepts understood in terms of logical possibility. This is so much part of its nature that it does no more than convert logical possibility into transcendental possibility. It brings spatio-temporal relations into correspondence with the logical relations of the concept. However, since it remains external to the concept, it is not clear how it can ensure the harmony of the understanding and sensibility, since it does not even have the means to ensure its own harmony with the understanding without appeal to a miracle. Schematism possesses an immense power. It can divide a concept and specify it according to a typology. A concept alone is completely incapable of specifying or dividing itself. The agents of differentiation are the spatiotemporal dynamisms which act within or beneath it, like a hidden art. Without these, we would still confront the questions which Aristotle raised with regard to Platonic division: where do the halves come from? However, the schema does not account for the power with which it acts. Everything changes when the dynamisms are posited no longer as schemata of concepts but as dramas of ideas. For if the dynamism is external to concepts, and, as such, a schema, it is internal to ideas, and, as such, a drama or dream. Species are divided into lineages, lineans into Jordanants, concepts into types, but these divisions do not have the same criteria as the divided, they are not homogeneous with the divided, and they are established in a domain external to that of concepts but internal to that of the ideas which preside over division itself. Dynamism thus comprises its own power of determining space and time, since it immediately incarnates the differential relations, the singularities, and the progressivities immanent in the idea. 30 The shortest is not simply the schema of the concept of straight, but the dream, the drama, or the dramatization of the idea of a line insofar as it expresses the differentiation of the straight from the curved. We distinguish ideas, concepts, and dramas. The role of dramas is to specify concepts by incarnating the differential relations and singularities of an idea. Dramatization takes place under the critical eye of the savant as much as it does in the head of the dreamer. It acts below the sphere of concepts and the representations subsumed by them. There is nothing which does not lose its identity as this is constituted by concepts, and its similarity as this is constituted in representation, when the dynamic space and time of its actual constitution is discovered. The type hill is no more than a stream along parallel lines, the type slope an outcrop of hard layers along which the rocks are buried in a direction perpendicular to that of the hills, but on ideas and the synthesis of difference. 219 The scale of millions of years which constitutes the time of their actualization, the hardest rocks in turn are fluid matters which flow under the weak constraints exercised on their singularities. Every typology is dramatic, every dynamism a catastrophe. There is necessarily something cruel in this birth of a world which is a chaosmus, in these worlds of movements without subjects, roles without actors. When Artaud spoke of the theatre of cruelty, he defined it only in terms of an extreme determinism, that of spatiotemporal determination insofar as it incarnates an idea of mind or nature, like a restless space or movement of turning and wounding gravitation capable of directly affecting the organism, a pure staging without author, without actors, and without subjects. Spaces are hollowed out, time is accelerated or decelerated, only at the cost of strains and displacements which mobilize and compromise the whole body. Shining points pierce us, singularities turn us back upon ourselves, everywhere the tortoise's neck with its vertiginous sliding of protovertebrae. Even the sky suffers from its cardinal points and its constellations which, like actor suns, inscribe ideas in its flesh. There are indeed actors and subjects, but these are larvae, since they alone are capable of sustaining the lines, the slippages, and the rotations. Afterwards it is too late. It is true that every idea turns us into larvae, having put aside the identity of the I along with the resemblance of the self. This is badly described as a matter of regression, fixation, or our station of development, for we are never fixed at a moment or in a given state but always fixed by an idea as though in the glimmer of a look, always fixed in a movement that is underway. What would ideas be if not the fixed and cruel ideas of which Villers de l'Isle Adam speaks? We are always patients where ideas are concerned. This, however, is not an ordinary fixation or patience. What is fixed is not ready-made or already complete. When we remain or again become embryos, it is rather because of this pure movement of repetition which is fundamentally distinguished from all regression. The larvae bear ideas in their flesh, while we do not go beyond the representations of the concepts. They know nothing of the domain of the possible, being close to the virtual, the first actualizations of which they bear as though they had chosen them. Such is the intimacy of the leech and the higher man, they are at once dream and science, object of dreams and object of science, bite and knowledge, mouth and brain. Perrier spoke of the conflict between mouth and brain played out between the vertebrates and the annulate worms. Ideas are dramatized at several levels, but so too dramatizations of different orders echo one another across these levels. Take the idea of an island, geographical dramatization differentiates it or divides the concept into two types, the original oceanic type which signals an eruption or raising above the sea, and the continental drift type which results from a disarticulation or fracture. The island dreamer, however, rediscovers this 220 difference and repetition double dynamism because he dreams of becoming infinitely cut off, at the end of a long drift, but also of an absolute beginning by means of a radical foundation. It has often been remarked that the global sexual behavior of men and women tends to reproduce the movement of their organs, and that the latter in turn tend to reproduce the dynamism of the cellular elements, psychic, organic, and chemical. Three dramatizations of different orders echo one another. While it is thought which must explore the virtual down to the ground of its repetitions, it is imagination which must grasp the process of actualization from the point of view of these echoes or reprises. It is imagination which crosses domains, orders, and levels, knocking down the partitions coextensive with the world, guiding our bodies and inspiring our souls, grasping the unity of mind and nature, a larval consciousness which moves endlessly from science to dream and back again. Actualization takes place in three series: space, time, and also consciousness. Every spatiotemporal dynamism is accompanied by the emergence of an elementary consciousness which itself traces directions, doubles movements, and migrations, and is born on the threshold of the condensed singularities of the body or object whose consciousness it is. It is not enough to say that consciousness is consciousness of something, it is the double of this something, and everything is consciousness because it possesses a double, even if it is far off and very foreign. Repetition is everywhere, as much in what is actualized as in its actualization. It is in the idea to begin with, and it runs through the varieties of relations and the distribution of singular points. It also determines the reproductions of space and time, as it does the reprises of consciousness. In every case, repetition is the power of difference and differentiation, because it condenses the singularities, or because it accelerates or decelerates time, or because it alters spaces. Repetition is never explained by the form of identity in the concept, nor by the similar in representation. No doubt conceptual blockage gives rise to a bare repetition that we can effectively represent as the repetition of the same. However, who blocks the concept, if not the idea? Moreover, as we have seen, the blockage takes place along the three lines of space, time, and consciousness. It is the excess in the idea which explains the lack in the concept. Similarly, it is the clothed, singular or extraordinary repetition, dependent upon the idea, which explains that ordinary, bare repetition which is dependent upon the concept and plays only the role of the outer garment. In the idea and its actualization, we find at once both the natural reason for conceptual blockage and the supernatural reason for a repetition superior to that subsumed within the blocked concept. What remains outside the concept refers more profoundly to what is inside the idea. The entire idea is caught up in the mathematico-biological system of differentiation. However, mathematics and biology appear here only in the guise of technical models which allow ideas and the synthesis of difference. 221 The exposition of the virtual and the process of actualization, along with the exploration of the two halves of difference, the dialectical half and the aesthetic half. The dialectical idea is doubly determined by the variety of differential relations and the distribution of correlative singularities, differentiation. Aesthetic actualization is doubly determined by the determination of species and by composition, differentiation. The determination of species incarnates the relations, just as composition does the singularities. The actual qualities and parts, species, and numbers, correspond to the element of qualitability and the element of quantitability in the idea. However, what carries out the third aspect of sufficient reason, namely, the element of potentiality in the idea? No doubt the pre-quantitative and pre-qualitative dramatization. It is this, in effect, which determines or unleashes, which differentiates the differentiation of the actual in its correspondence with the differentiation of the idea. Where, however, does this power of dramatization come from? Is it not, beneath the species and parts, the quality